They built him into a king, then they burned him in the same fire they used to crown him. Alpha Drazhen Morvain stood on that dais and did the one thing no sovereign should ever do. He chose strategy over the woman who would have died for his throne. And the moment those words left his mouth, sever it, every calculation he'd ever made started bleeding out on that marble floor. Here's the thing, nobody tells you about power. It doesn't break you in battle. It breaks you in the silence after you've destroyed the one thing that was actually real. Stay with me to the end of this. Hit that like. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where in this world my people are watching from. This story is just getting started. The storm had been building since midday. Seris Vaelor felt it in her wrists before she ever stepped foot inside the Celestine Citadel. That particular pressure behind the skin, the way the air gets when something enormous is about to break open. She'd grown up in the northern territories where storms came fast and without apology, and she'd learned early that the body knew things the mind hadn't caught up to yet. Her body had been screaming all afternoon. She ignored it. That was her first mistake, not the last. The citadel rose above the capital like a declaration, all obsidian towers and silver lantern light, and on any other night she would have found it beautiful. On this night, dressed in white ceremonial silk stitched with the silver runes of union, she found it suffocating. The fabric was heavy across her shoulders. The runes caught the light in a way that made her look like something between a bride and a sacrifice, and she couldn't decide which she was supposed to be, so she kept her chin up and her eyes forward and walked like a woman who'd already survived worse than this. She had. Barely. The moon oath, dais stood at the center of the imperial amphitheater, carved from a single block of pale stone quarried from the Ashfang Mountains 3 centuries ago. Seris had read about it in the historical texts Drazhen had given her during the early months of their bonding period, back when he still believed in the gesture of sharing knowledge with her. The stone was supposed to carry the permanence of the mountains themselves into the oath spoken above it. Permanence. She turned the word over in her mind as she ascended the 3 steps to the dais. Drazhen was already there. King Alpha Drazhen Morvain, sovereign of the Ashfang Dominion, stood with his hands clasped behind his back in that particular posture of his, rigid through the spine, shoulders squared, the posture of a man who had been performing absolute control for so long that performance and truth had become the same thing. He was dressed in full ceremonial black with the wolf head crest of the Dominion pinned above his heart. He did not look at her when she stepped onto the dais beside him. That should have told her everything. Seris took her position at his left. The amphitheater stretched out before them, thousands of faces ascending in tiers, noble houses in their gallery sections with their jeweled masks and careful expressions, council ministers in their formal robes, generals from the frontier campaigns, priests and record keepers, and half the political machinery of an empire crammed into one echoing space. Torch fire and lantern light moved together in the updraft from so many bodies. The wolf banners rippled above. She looked out at all of it and thought, I have been preparing for this moment for 2 years. Then the ancient priest began the opening rites, and she felt the bond light stir between her wrist and Drazhen's, and she made the mistake of glancing sideways at his face. He was already watching her, not with anticipation, not with the controlled warmth she'd learned to read in him during the rare moments he allowed himself something close to honesty. He was watching her the way he watched maps before a campaign, assessing, measuring the distance between where things stood and where he needed them to be. Her stomach dropped. The priest spoke the ritual words of union. The bond light between their wrists grew stronger, silver white and steady as a heartbeat. Around them, the court leaned forward. This was the moment. The crown bond, final and irrevocable. The last formal step in a year of political negotiations, treaty arrangements, and bloodline documentation that had made Seris Vaelor the future queen of the Ashfang Dominion. Drazhen looked down at the light between their wrists. 1 second, 2. Then he spoke. Sever it. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Seris had ever heard. It lasted perhaps 3 full seconds, and in those 3 seconds, the amphitheater seemed to actually stop breathing. Council ministers who had been shifting into ceremonial postures went completely still. 2 of the frontier generals looked at each other with the expression of men who have just heard something that rearranges the tactical landscape. The priest's voice died mid-syllable. Seris stood very straight. She did not cry. She would think about that later, in the cold miles north of the capital, and she would not entirely understand it. The absence of tears. What she felt was not emptiness. It was closer to something calcifying, like watching water turn to stone in real time, feeling the process happen inside her own chest. She lifted her eyes toward him. Drazhen. His jaw was set. He wasn't looking at her anymore. I reject the crown bond, he said. The silver fire cracked. It did not break gently. Nothing about the Ashfang Dominion broke gently. The bond light fractured between them like a fault line splitting open, silver white, giving way to something dark and cold. And Seris felt the sensation of it up her arm into her shoulder, a wrongness that was almost physical pain but wasn't. It was deeper than pain. It was the nervous system registering that something which should have existed permanently has just been removed from the category of possible things. The amphitheater erupted. Not in sound, not immediately. First in movement. That collective physical jolt of thousands of people registering something unthinkable. Then the whispers began. A sound like fire spreading through dry grass, and then voices from the upper galleries, and then the council ministers were leaning toward each other, and the generals had lost their ceremonial composure entirely. The priest was making a sound that wasn't quite words. Public rejection of a bonded queen hadn't happened within living memory. The scholars would later spend considerable time identifying the last recorded instance. In this moment, the priest simply looked at his ritual texts as though they might offer instructions for this particular emergency. Seris lowered her arm. The broken mark on her wrist was still faintly luminous, the way embers look when the fire has gone out, but the heat hasn't dissipated yet. She studied it for a moment. She was aware, in a distant and clinical way, that the entire empire was watching her face right now. What they would see on it in the next 30 seconds would determine how history recorded this moment. She decided what they would see. She raised her eyes from her wrist and looked directly at Drazhen Morvain, sovereign of the Ashfang Dominion, and she made her expression say, "You have made an error. Not grief, not humiliation, that." He saw it. Something moved briefly through his face. Not regret, she wouldn't give him that, but something adjacent to surprise. He had expected tears, or rage, or the frozen shock of a woman whose world has just collapsed. He had prepared for those responses. He did not appear to have prepared for the look of someone who has just reclassified you from ally to opponent and found the reclassification clarifying. Seris descended from the moon oath dais. 1 step, 2, 3. She kept her spine straight and her pace measured, and she walked like a woman with somewhere important to be, even though she had absolutely nowhere to go, because the alternative was letting them watch her fall apart, and some things you simply do not surrender, not to the man who broke you in public, not to the court that let him do it, not to any empire in any world. She had reached the base of the dais when the gates thundered open. The sound hit first, those massive iron-reinforced doors swinging outward in a way that suggested they hadn't been asked permission, just moved. Cold air swept through the amphitheater like a blade, carrying the smell of storm and mountain cold and something else, leather and iron, and the particular scent of men who have ridden hard and don't apologize for it. Seris stopped. Every instinct she had, honed through 2 years of navigating the most politically treacherous court in the Northern Territories, told her to hold absolutely still and process what she was seeing before she moved another step. Through the open gates came a company of soldiers in midnight dark armor, wolf killers, and iron breakers, men whose faces said they'd seen the edges of the world and hadn't been improved by the experience. They moved in formation with the particular economy of soldiers who don't waste motion because wasted motion gets you killed. They spread to the sides of the entrance without being told to, creating a corridor. And through that corridor walked King Alpha Zevrik Draven. Seris had heard of him. Everyone had heard of him. The Nightclaw Imperium sat beyond the eastern mountain ranges, and its ruler had spent the last decade doing things that made for extraordinary intelligence reports, expanding territory through a combination of direct military action and political pressure so precise it bordered on art, refusing alliances that didn't serve him, winning 3 campaigns that military historians had formally classified as unwinnable before the fact. The Black Sovereign. That was what the whisper networks called him. Not a name you gave someone you trusted, but not a name you gave someone you dismissed either. She had expected something more theatrical. He wasn't theatrical. He was dangerous in the way that still water over depth is dangerous. Not because it announces itself, but because it doesn't. His midnight cloak was travel-worn at the hem. His jaw carried several days of dark beard that no court would have permitted on a ceremonial night, which meant either he hadn't planned to be here in time for ceremony, or he had decided ceremonial expectations didn't apply to him. Both possibilities were interesting. He was tall in the way that powerful men sometimes are. Not the performative height of men who want to be noticed, but the height of someone who takes up space because he has always understood that space belongs to those willing to inhabit it fully. His eyes moved through the chamber in one long sweep. Then they settled directly on Seris. Not the throne, not Drazhen. Her. The amphitheater was still making its noise, shock and anger and political calculus dressed up as outrage. But the moment Zevrik Draven's gaze landed on Seris Vaelor, something changed in the acoustic quality of the room. A different kind of silence began spreading from where they stood, because watching two people look at each other is sometimes more interesting than any speech, and courts understand spectacle instinctively. He crossed the marble floor. His soldiers didn't follow. He didn't look at Drazhen. He stopped 7 feet from Seris. "You are the rejected queen," he said. The words struck harder than she expected, not because they were cruel, because they weren't. They were simply accurate, stated with the flat precision of a man who calls things what they are. And there is something uniquely devastating about being witnessed clearly in the worst moment of your life. She met his gaze. "I'm the woman who just walked off the Moon Oath dais," she said. The queen part was never finalized. Something shifted at the edge of his expression, not quite a smile, something more considered. "No," he said. "It wasn't." Behind them, Drazhen Morvain descended from the throne platform with the controlled fury of a man who has spent 20 years learning to make anger look like authority. "You overstep," Drazhen said. His voice carried to every corner of the amphitheater. Designed to. "This is sovereign territory and a sovereign ceremony, Draven. Whatever your purpose in arriving uninvited and unannounced—" "My purpose," Zevrik said without turning around, "was arriving before this became worse than it already is." He turned then, slowly. With the unhurried movement of someone who has decided the speed of his reaction is itself a message. Drazhen stopped 6 feet away. The two men regarded each other across the broken ceremony and the watching court, and the particular weight of two empires sharing the same marble floor. Seris stayed where she was and watched them both. She had learned in her years navigating Ashfang politics that the most important thing to do in any room full of powerful people is watch and not speak until speaking becomes the only option. You learn more from silence than you ever do from conversation. Conversations are performance. Silence is diagnostic. What she learned in the next 30 seconds was this. Drazhen was angry in the way of a man surprised. Zevrik was composed in the way of a man who had planned for multiple outcomes and was currently determining which one had materialized. That distinction mattered enormously. "You were not invited to this ceremony," Drazhen said. "I'm aware. Then you understand the protocol violation you're committing. A sovereign king entering another sovereign's imperial ceremony without notification or invitation is an act of considerable boldness," Zevrik said. "Yes, I'm familiar with the classification." Drazhen's jaw tightened. "Is that meant to be amusing?" "It's meant to be honest." Zevrik looked toward the galleries, toward the watching faces of ministers and noble houses, and he let the silence expand deliberately before continuing. "You performed a public rejection of a crown bond, in the Celestine Citadel, in front of your entire court." He looked back at Drazhen. "I'm not the one who violated protocol tonight." The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. It had edges. Seris watched Drazhen absorb it. She had spent 2 years studying this man's face in the moments when the architecture of his control was under stress, and she could see it now, the minute tightening around the eyes, the slight shift in his breathing. He was recalculating, rapidly. The problem for Drazhen, and she understood this with a clarity that felt almost like pity, was that Zevrik was right, and the court knew it, and there was no political maneuver available to change that fundamental fact. He could demand Zevrik leave, and Zevrik might or might not leave, But either way, the narrative had already been written by Zevrik's entrance and words. Dominance in a court isn't only about what you command. It's about what story the room is telling about you when you're not speaking. Right now, the room was telling a very bad story about Drazhen Morvain. "What precisely?" Drazhen said. "Do you want, Draven?" Zevrik glanced briefly at Seris, then back. "I want to understand the situation." "The situation is a domestic matter of the Ashfang Dominion." "The situation," Zevrik said, "is that a woman who committed 2 years of formal bonding obligations to this court is standing at the base of your dais with a broken mark on her wrist and nowhere to go. That stopped being entirely domestic the moment it became public." Seris's fingers curled slightly at her side. He wasn't wrong about the nowhere to go part. That was the stripped-down, bone-honest reality of her position, and she was still working through the full dimensions of it, even as she stood here holding herself together through sheer will. The Vaelor estates were technically hers, but they were also located 3 days' ride inside Ashfang territory, and her legal status had just been fundamentally altered by a man who controlled Ashfang territory. Her family's political alliances had been restructured around the Crown Bond. Her network of contacts and relationships existed almost entirely within a court that had just watched her be dismissed. She was, in the most practical sense, exposed. And Zevrik Draven had just announced that observation to several thousand people, which was either a move of devastating carelessness or deliberate precision. She didn't think it was carelessness. "You remain under my protection," Drazhen said. He directed it at Seris. His voice had shifted register. Still authority, but something else underneath it now, something that was trying to be reassurance and wasn't quite getting there. She looked at him for a long moment. "Protection ended when respect did," she said. The galleries erupted. Not all at once. It moved through sections like a wave, the initial gasps from the minister section closest to them, spreading upward to the noble houses and outward to the general galleries, a sound compounded of shock and something else. That particular note crowds make when they've witnessed something that touches something true. When truth and spectacle arrive at the same moment, courts feel it physically. Drazhen stared at her. For a moment, just a moment, something cracked in his expression that had nothing to do with authority or strategy or political calculation. It was the look of a man who has just heard himself described accurately and does not enjoy the description. Whatever he felt underneath all that iron discipline, she saw it briefly. Then it was gone. "You are making an extraordinary error," he said quietly. Quiet enough that only she and Zevrik could hear it clearly. "Your position is more vulnerable than you understand. Whatever you feel right now, and I understand why you feel it, walking away from this court is not survivable politics." "You just rejected me in front of your entire empire," Seris said. Her voice was equally quiet. "And you're explaining vulnerability to me." "I'm explaining reality." "No," she said. "You're explaining your reality. The one where I factor into your calculations and not much else." Drazhen's eyes moved to Zevrik, then back. "Is this about him?" The question had genuine uncertainty in it, which surprised her. "It's about me," she said. Zevrik had moved, almost without appearing to move, until he was standing beside her. Not touching. Not claiming. Simply present in the space adjacent to her, which in the language of court politics was itself a declaration. Drazhen registered it. His expression went through several rapid transformations before settling back into command posture. "Draven," he said, full sovereign authority in his voice now. "Whatever you imagine you're doing here, whatever political leverage you think this evening has handed you, I would strongly advise you to consider the consequences of continued interference in Ashfang internal affairs." "I'm not interfering," Zevrik said. "I'm observing. You are standing at the side of a woman I have just formally separated from this court." "I'm standing in the Celestine Citadel," Zevrik said. "She happens to be standing in roughly the same direction." Someone in the galleries laughed. A single voice, quickly suppressed, but it had happened, and courts remember laughter, because laughter, at the wrong moment, is the most honest thing a room can produce. Drazhen went very still. Seris understood the danger of the moment. She understood it the way you understand a blade against your ribs. Not abstractly, but physically. Drazhen Morvain had built 20 years of rule on the certainty that his authority was absolute within his territory. Tonight, His authority had been publicly questioned by the woman he'd discarded, and now visibly challenged by a rival king who was standing in his citadel with the particular ease of a man who found the challenge interesting. The combination of those things, inside a man of Drazhen's construction, was the architecture of catastrophe. She had seen him make strategic decisions that were brilliant. She had also seen him, in 2 years of intimate proximity, encounter the moments when the strategy stopped working and what remained was the man underneath the strategy. The man underneath the strategy was more dangerous because he was less predictable. "Step away from her," Drazhen said to Zevrik. Zevrik looked at him with something that bordered on patience. "I'm not standing near her because I was told to. I'm standing near her because I chose to." He let that sit for exactly 1 beat. Same way you rejected her because you chose to. Choices have locations. This is where mine put me. Drazhen descended the remaining steps from the throne platform. He moved with deliberate control, each step measured, and Seris watched the court watching him and saw the calculation in every face. Ministers who had served him for a decade were doing the mathematics of loyalty and survival. Generals were assessing territorial implications. Noble houses were reconstructing alliance maps in real time. This was what power looked like when it started bleeding. Not broken, not destroyed, just leaking. The way a great ship takes on water, functional for a long time after the hull cracks, still moving, still enormous, but the destination has changed. Drazhen stopped in front of both of them. He looked at Seris with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not quite remorse, not quite anger, something that lived in the territory between them. 2 years, he said. Quiet again. Meant for her. You think I made this decision without cost? I think, Seris said carefully, that you made it with the wrong kind of calculation. You measured what you'd gain. You didn't account for what you'd lose. Varel Thorn's alliance brings 3 frontier territories into alignment. I know what it brings, she said. I did that analysis myself 3 months ago, when I first started wondering why your behavior toward me was changing. I know exactly what the trade looked like on paper. Drazhen's expression shifted. You knew. I suspected. And you came tonight anyway. I came tonight because I made a commitment, Seris said. That's the difference between us. I honor commitments even when they're costing me. You break them when the cost-benefit analysis turns. The silence after that was long and specific. Across the amphitheater, positioned in the gallery section reserved for the political consorts of visiting dignitaries, Lady Varel Thorn stood with her hands folded and her expression composed in the careful way of a person who has spent years learning to make satisfaction invisible. She was tall and precise in the way of a woman who had turned political intelligence into a kind of beauty, dark-haired, dressed in the deep green of her family house. She said nothing. She hadn't needed to say anything all evening. Her silence was the loudest thing in the room. Seris had seen her the moment she entered the citadel. She had filed the information and said nothing, and kept moving, because some knowledge you hold quietly until it becomes necessary. It had become necessary. She looked directly at Varel Thorn across the full width of the imperial amphitheater, across the broken ceremony and the watching court and the 2 kings standing between them. She held the look for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to communicate clearly, short enough to communicate that she didn't need more time than that. Then she looked away. Varel Thorn's composure cracked very slightly at the edges. Drazhen caught it. His head turned toward the gallery, and Seris watched the moment of recognition cross his face. The moment when a man realizes the woman he discarded has understood his situation more thoroughly than he credited her with, and has just demonstrated it publicly. It was not a comfortable realization to witness. This is done, Drazhen said. His voice had returned to sovereign register, that particular quality of sound that was designed to close conversations and move rooms in specific directions. Whatever drama this evening has produced, whatever interpretations various parties choose to take from it, the practical reality is straightforward. Lady Vaelor remains a guest of this court until her legal status is formally processed, and her return to the Vaelor estates can be appropriately arranged. Draven, your presence here is unauthorized, and your participation in Ashfang domestic affairs is— I am standing for her freedom, Zevrik said. The words arrived without drama or construction. Just said. Clean and simple, the way weapons are simple when you understand what they're for. The shock that moved through the amphitheater was different from the earlier shocks. The rejection of the crown bond had been a violation of ritual and expectation. This was different. This was the ruler of a rival empire, standing in the seat of his rival's power, making a public declaration about the woman that rival had just discarded. The geopolitical dimensions of that statement moved through the court like fire moving through oil, fast and total. The priest started shouting first. Then the council ministers were on their feet. 3 of the frontier generals had their hands on ceremonial weapons and were looking to Drazhen for guidance. The noble houses in the upper galleries had abandoned any pretense of decorum. Drazhen went very still for a full 3 seconds. Then, "You use this moment to weaken me." Zevrik didn't look ashamed of it. "Of course," he said. That honesty sent another shock through the room, because courts are not accustomed to honesty, particularly not from rival kings regarding their political maneuvers. "I exploit opportunity," Zevrik continued, "but I don't disguise cruelty as necessity." The accusation landed in Drazhen's chest and showed on his face for half a second before he controlled it. "You know nothing about necessity. I know that you rejected a woman who spent 2 years building your court relationships, managing your Eastern diplomatic correspondence, and holding together 3 noble house alliances that were fraying at the seams before she arrived." Zevrik's voice hadn't risen. It didn't need to. The content was doing the work. "I know that information because I have good people in places that collect it. I also know that you rejected her tonight in exchange for Virel Thorn's Frontier Alliance, which gives you military access to the Red Claw passes before winter closes them." He looked at Drazhen steadily. "Your calculation makes sense. Your execution was brutal, and you dressed it up as policy." The silence was absolute. Drazhen said nothing for a long time. This was the thing about power, Seris thought, the thing they never tell you when you're learning to navigate it. Power doesn't corrupt through grand villainy. The stories make it too simple, the tyrant who wakes up one morning and decides to become monstrous. Reality is quieter and more devastating. Power teaches you, slowly and thoroughly and with positive reinforcement at every step, to rename your compromises as necessities. Your betrayals become strategy. Your cruelty becomes policy. The man who was once capable of genuine loyalty learns to call loyalty a liability, and eventually he genuinely believes it because believing it makes the loneliness bearable. She looked at Drazhen Morvain and saw not a villain, but a man who had been making small trade-offs for 20 years and had finally made one too large to recover from. And she felt something that she didn't want to feel, and which she recognized and named honestly, because dishonesty about your own interior was the first step toward becoming something you didn't intend. She felt grief. Not for herself, for the version of him she had believed was possible. "Seris," Drazhen said. He moved toward her. The authority in his posture had shifted into something more personal, more direct, and therefore more dangerous because personal desperation in a powerful man is unpredictable in ways that political authority isn't. Whatever you feel right now, and I'm not dismissing it, leaving this court tonight, leaving with him, is not what you want. You know that. "Tell me what I want," she said. "You want what you came here for, what you built toward. The position, the influence, the ability to actually—" "To what?" she said. "To matter? To have access to actual power instead of proximity to yours?" He stopped. "To do the work," she said. "To fix the things in your court that I could see were broken. The eastern border taxation structure that's bleeding the frontier settlements. The noble house inheritance laws that are costing you loyalty from 3 of your youngest generation lords. The agricultural treaty with the southern provinces that expired 8 months ago and hasn't been renegotiated because your council considers it beneath formal attention." She looked at him. "I was going to fix those things, because I could see them and you couldn't, and that was useful. That was what I was for. And you just decided another kind of useful was more important." Drazhen was quiet. "You're right," he said finally. The admission surprised her. "I know it," he said. "About all of those issues. I knew your value to this court. I made a calculation that prioritized military access over administrative competence, and the Red Claw passes before winter close the only viable—" He stopped himself. He seemed to hear what he was doing, the explanation becoming justification, becoming the same pattern she'd named. "I made the choice I made." "Yes," Seris said. "You did." The moment stretched. Behind her, she could feel Zevrik Draven's presence, like a particular quality of air, the way a large body heat warms the space around it in winter. He hadn't moved. He wasn't intervening. He was simply there, which was itself a choice, and she found herself acutely aware of that choice in a way she would process later when she had the space to think clearly. Then Drazen reached out and took her wrist. Not hard, not cruel, just took it. The broken mark flickered faintly between them, the remnant of a bond that no longer existed. His grip was the grip of a man who has just realized what slipping through his fingers feels like, and is trying to stop it too late. "Do not humiliate me further," he said quietly. "You have made your point. The court has seen everything there is to see. If you walk out of this citadel tonight, there is no political path back to—" "There is no path back," Seris said. "That's the thing you're not understanding." His grip tightened slightly. "You don't have anywhere to go, Seris." "I have my feet," she said. "I have my mind. I have 2 years of experience in the most politically complex court in the Northern Territories." She looked down at his hand on her wrist, then back up at his face. "Let go. The Vaelor estates are inside my— Let go, Drazen." He held for 3 more seconds. She counted them. Then he released her. She stepped backward, 1 step, then another, moving away from the throne and the broken bond and the ceremony debris and everything she had spent 2 years building toward. "You already humiliated yourself," she said. Not cruel, just honest, in the way that accurate descriptions of reality are honest rather than cruel. Drazen stood with his hand still slightly extended and his empire watching and his political consort quiet in the gallery above and everything he'd built undamaged around him. The territory, the armies, the alliances, the crown, and still something essential was absent from the room. Seris descended the final steps from the dais level to the main floor of the amphitheater. She stood on that marble floor and she breathed for a moment. Just breathed. The cold air from the open gates reached her, and she let it, because cold air was honest and honesty was what she needed right now. She was aware that Zevrik Draven had moved to stand beside her. She didn't look at him yet. She looked at the amphitheater instead, at the thousands of faces watching her, at the wolf banners rippling in the updraft, at the ancient stone of the Celestine Citadel, 3 centuries old, built to outlast the people who filled it, at the priests standing with their ritual texts and their helpless expressions, at Virel Thorn in the gallery, who had stopped pretending her expression was composed, at the council ministers and generals and noble house representatives who would all, before this night was over, begin the process of deciding what this moment meant for their own calculations. She was walking away. From the crown. From the position. From 2 years of work and an empire she had started to love, in the complicated way you love difficult things. Not because they're easy, but because they're worth the effort. She was walking toward uncertainty and the cold outside these walls, and a future she couldn't see the shape of yet. And the thing she felt, underneath the grief and the anger and the particular exhaustion of a woman who has just been through the most publicly devastating moment of her adult life, was something she hadn't expected. She felt like herself. She walked toward the gates. Zevrik fell into step beside her. Neither of them spoke as the gates approached. Seris kept her pace steady, her back straight, her expression the careful neutral of a woman who will not perform distress for the benefit of audiences. She was aware of every footstep behind her, the particular silence of thousands of people watching someone walk away from everything they were supposed to become. She was 10 feet from the gates when Drazen's voice crossed the entire amphitheater. "You would abandon your kingdom for him?" She stopped. She stood with her back to the room for exactly 2 seconds. Then she turned, the full length of the imperial amphitheater between them. Drazen, on the floor near the dais, surrounded by his ministers and his guards and his empire, his face stripped of the last layer of political composure, the fury and the confusion, and something that might, in a weaker man, have been called grief, but in Drazhen Morvain expressed itself as wound-edged demand. Seris looked at him across all of that distance. "No," she said. Her voice carried. She had learned that in 2 years at his court, how to make her voice fill the spaces it needed to fill. "I leave because of you." The galleries erupted. She turned back toward the gates. She was done. Zevrik's hand found her elbow briefly. Not possessive, not claiming, just the physical language of, I'm here, I'm real, this direction is forward. And then it was gone. And they were walking, and the cold night air hit them full in the face as they crossed the threshold of the Celestine Citadel into the darkness outside. Behind them, she heard the exact moment that Drazhen Morvain crossed from wounded authority into pure impulsive fury. She heard the collective sound of thousands of people reacting to something happening on the floor of the amphitheater. She heard a blade being drawn, the particular metallic whisper of a ceremonial weapon leaving its scabbard. She heard voices shouting for order, and voices shouting back, and the particular chaos sound of a court losing its composure all at once. She heard all of it, and she kept walking. Into the storm, into the dark, into whatever came next. They had reached the outer causeway, the citadel gates 20 feet behind them, and the imperial city sprawling below in its thousands of lights, when Zevrik stopped and looked back toward the sounds coming from the citadel. Seris stopped too. She looked at him looking back. At the strong profile in the dark, the careful expression of a man sorting through multiple contingencies simultaneously, deciding which response served which outcome. Your soldiers, she said. Inside, he said. Positioned. You expected this to go badly. He looked at her. I planned for several versions of how it could go. And this one, he considered. Better than some. She almost laughed. She didn't. The night was too cold and too large, and she had too much processing still to do to give anything away yet. Why did you come? She said. It wasn't quite a question. I told you I was standing for your... Don't, she said. Don't give me the performance. The performance was for the court. He was quiet for a moment. In the darkness, his face was harder to read, which meant she had to rely on other things. The quality of his silence, the set of his shoulders, the way his breathing moved. I came, he said slowly, because men like Drazhen Morvain need to understand that their choices have observers. And I had been watching you for 2 years, he said, through reports, through diplomatic correspondence, through the particular way your name kept appearing in intelligence about the Ashfang court's competence in areas it hadn't been competent in before you arrived. He looked at her directly. You interested me. I wanted to see what you do with what just happened to you. Seris absorbed that. And, she said again, you didn't fall apart. I wanted to, but you didn't, he said. That distinction is everything. She looked out at the imperial city below, at the thousands of lights that didn't know or care what had just happened in the Celestine Citadel, at the storm clouds moving across the mountains in the north. I have no position, she said, no legal standing in Ashfang territory. My estates are... Your estates are a problem for morning, Zevrik said. Tonight we ride. North. We clear the Ashfang territorial line before Drazhen decides what his next move is, because his next move will involve restricting your movement options, and I would prefer you to have options. She looked at him. You're very certain I'm coming with you. No, he said. I'm very certain you should. Whether you do is yours. The distinction landed. She was quiet for a long moment, standing on the imperial causeway with the cold wind coming down from the mountains and the lights of the capital below, and the sounds of chaos still drifting from the citadel behind them. She had nowhere to go. That was the honest truth of it, the brutal, stripped-bare reality of her position. She had spent 2 years building her entire future within the infrastructure of the Ashfang Dominion, and that infrastructure had just been removed from underneath her in front of several thousand witnesses. And the options available to her in the immediate term were Drazhen's court, which would process her legal status on Drazhen's timeline and by Drazhen's design. Her family, who were 3 political generations deep in Ashfang alliances, and would need considerable time to recalibrate before they could offer her anything meaningful. Or the man standing beside her in the dark, who ruled a rival empire and had arrived uninvited to her humiliation and made public declarations about standing for her freedom and was now calmly discussing riding north before morning, made the options worse. She looked at him. You said you planned for several versions, she said. Yes. What happens in the version where I say no? His expression didn't change. I ride north. You stay here or you don't. Drazhen does what he does. History records whatever it records. And you gain nothing. I gain an accurate understanding of your judgment, he said. which is itself useful. She studied him for a long moment. The cold came down from the mountains and the storm moved closer, and somewhere in the citadel behind them, something was happening that was going to reshape the next 10 years of northern politics, regardless of what she decided in the next 30 seconds. "My judgment," she said. "Yes." "Which you've been watching for 2 years." "Yes." "And what does your judgment tell you about mine?" He looked at her with those dark eyes that were, she was discovering, surprisingly readable once you knew you were allowed to read them. "That you came tonight even when you suspected what was coming," he said. "That you walked off that dais without losing your composure. That you looked at Varel Thorn across the full width of the amphitheater and cracked her composure with a 3-second glance." He paused. "That you told Drazhen Morvain the exact nature of his error in terms he could not dismiss or reframe. That you walked away from a throne rather than beg for it." He held her gaze. "Your judgment is extraordinary. It's exactly the problem." "The problem. For anyone trying to manage you," he said. "Yes." She felt the edge of something she hadn't felt all evening. Not exactly warm, more like recognition. The particular quality of being seen accurately by someone who has been paying careful attention. "We ride north," she said. Not a question. Confirmation. Something in his posture shifted very slightly. Not relief. Too controlled for relief. Satisfaction, maybe. The satisfaction of a contingency plan becoming the primary plan. "We ride north," he agreed. They turned from the Celestine Citadel together and started down the causeway toward where his soldiers waited with horses in the lower courtyard. The cold wind hit them both, and Seris pulled her white ceremonial silk tighter against the mountain air and thought, "I am still wearing the dress I was supposed to be crowned in." She found the irony clarifying. She found everything about this moment clarifying, actually. The cold and the dark and the distance growing between her and the citadel, and the uncomplicated reality of moving in a specific direction with a specific companion for a specific immediate purpose. It was the clearest she had felt in months. Behind them, she heard the citadel gates shut. Then she heard something else, a sound she recognized from her years managing diplomatic correspondence with the frontier territories. A sound she had read about in the military histories that Drazhen had given her in the early months. The particular resonance of the Celestine Citadel's war drums. She stopped. Zevrik had heard it too. He was already looking back. The Citadel's highest towers were lighting up. Not lantern light, the warm festive orange of the ceremony, but the cold white of signal fire. One tower, then two, then all three of the main towers. Signal fires meant one thing in the Ashfang Dominion. Mobilization. Seris stared at the lights. "He's calling the border garrisons," she said. Zevrik's expression had changed. For the first time since he'd walked through those gates, the composed certainty had shifted into something more alert, more operational. "Not the garrisons," he said. He was looking at the specific pattern of the fires. "That pattern is the Capitol Guard signal." He turned to her. His voice was very calm and very flat in the way of a man who has moved past reaction into response. "He's closing the city." She understood what that meant before he finished saying it. Closing the city meant the gates. Every gate. The Citadel gates, the inner district gates, the outer wall gates, the causeway checkpoints at the mountain passes north. "How long," she said, "before the north checkpoints are sealed?" Zevrik was already walking, fast. 40 minutes, he said. "If we ride now, we have 35. She lifted her ceremonial silk above her ankles and ran. They hit the lower courtyard at a full sprint, Zevrik's soldiers already reading the signal fires and moving without needing instruction. Horses being brought up, the quiet precision of men who have war game departure scenarios for exactly this kind of contingency. Seris took the horse they offered her without ceremony or comment. She swung into the saddle in ceremonial silk, which was not ideal riding attire, and she didn't care because the alternative was caring about attire while Drazhen Morvain sealed the mountain passes and turned her flight from a choice into a cage. Zevrik was already mounted. He looked at her across the dark courtyard. "There's something you should know," he said. His voice was even, almost too even. She was gathering her reins. "Tell me while we ride." "I received intelligence this afternoon," he said. Before I rode for the Citadel, from a source inside the Ashfang Council. He paused. The rejection tonight wasn't only about Varel Thorn's alliance. She looked at him. The signal fires were burning above the towers. 35 minutes, perhaps less, until the mountain passes closed. Tell me, she said. Zevrik looked at her with the expression of a man about to hand someone information that will change the entire shape of their understanding. Seris, he said, the crown bond wasn't rejected. It was severed specifically. There's a difference. A severed bond can be reinitiated. A rejected bond cannot. He held her gaze. Drazhen didn't close the door on the union permanently. He created a legal structure where he controls if and when it reopens. The implications landed, then landed again, deeper, as she understood the full architecture of what he was describing. He didn't discard me, she said. No, Zevrik said. He made me a resource he controls access to. Yes. The signal fires burned. The mountain wind came down cold and absolute. Somewhere above in the Citadel, Drazhen Morvain was making decisions that had probably been planned considerably in advance of tonight's ceremony. Seris looked at the fires, then looked at the road north. And the intelligence from your council source, she said. Was there more? Zevrik was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Yes, he said. Tell me. He looked at her, and in his face she saw the thing she had been learning to read since he'd walked through the Citadel gates. The quality of his silences, the precise control over what he released and what he held, the careful architecture of a man who calculates what information costs before he spends it. He had decided to spend this one. The source said Drazhen had planned the rejection 6 weeks ago, Zevrik said. The night you are standing for in that dress, the ceremony, the bond severance, was prepared, staged, every element of it. He paused, including my arrival. She stared at him. The signal fires burned. The horses shifted under them, impatient and cold. What, she said very quietly, do you mean by that? Zevrik looked at her with the expression of a man who has just told the truth about something that complicates his own position significantly. He knew I would come, Zevrik said. He arranged for me to receive information about tonight's ceremony through channels he controlled. He wanted me here. He needed a rival king to stand for you publicly so that when he eventually reopens the legal structure of the bond, she understood. It hit her like winter water, total and cold and complete. If Drazhen had simply rejected her and she'd returned to her estates in quiet political obscurity, the bond could eventually be reinitiated with minimal public drama. But if she left tonight with the ruler of a rival empire, if she was seen to choose a rival king's protection, then Drazhen held the moral position when he eventually moved to reopen the legal structure. She became the unfaithful party. She became the political liability. And reinitiating the bond became an act of magnanimity on his part rather than correction of a wrong. She had been walking into an architecture that was designed before she arrived. Zevrik was watching her face as she processed it. Then why are you telling me? She said. Because, he said, I did not come here to be used as a piece in his strategy. She looked at him. The signal fires had been burning for 4 minutes. They had perhaps 30 minutes left before the north passes closed. And what I choose to do with this information, she said slowly, changes every calculation, he said. His, mine, yours. She looked at the road north. She looked at the citadel behind them. She looked at Zevrik Draven, who had arrived at her humiliation and made public declarations and ridden to a lower courtyard and just handed her the most dangerous piece of information available, which had the simultaneous effect of protecting her from Drazhen's architecture and making his own position significantly more complicated, and who was watching her face with the particular expression of a man who has placed something valuable in uncertain hands and is waiting to see what happens to it. She gathered her reins. We ride, she said. And then you tell me everything else your source said. Something moved at the edge of his expression. She turned her horse north. And then the second set of signal fires lit up on the citadel towers. Not the Capitol Guard pattern, the other one. The one that used a different configuration. The one that Seris had read about in one particular intelligence report she had processed 8 months ago during her management of Ashfang Eastern diplomatic correspondence. The one that meant foreign agent activity inside the Dominion. She pulled her horse to a stop. Her blood went cold. Zevrik, she said, He had seen it too. "I know," he said. "That signal means your people," she said. "Inside the citadel. That signal means he has evidence, or he's claiming evidence, that your arrival tonight was planned as a foreign intelligence operation." "Yes," he said. She looked at him. The third signal fire lit. That configuration was the one she had never seen used in 2 years. The one that existed only in the oldest military documentation. The one that authorized immediate action. "What does that one mean?" she said. She already knew, but she needed to hear him say it. Zevrik looked at the fires for a long moment. "War," he said. The word hung in the dark between them like a blade that hadn't decided which direction to fall. War. Seris sat on her horse in the cold courtyard and looked at the third signal fire burning above the Celestine citadel, and understood with the particular clarity that arrives only in the worst moments that she had just been repositioned from a woman leaving a bad situation into something considerably more complicated and considerably more dangerous. "He moved faster than you expected," she said. It wasn't a question. She was watching Zevrik's face, and she could see the calculation happening in real time, the rapid processing of a man who is very good at planning and countering a variable that arrived earlier than projected. "He had this prepared," Zevrik said. "You said that already. About the ceremony." "I said he planned the rejection and my arrival." He looked at the signal fires. "I did not account for him having the war authorization staged at the same time. That is a different level of preparation." He was quiet for a moment. He was planning for escalation regardless of how tonight went. Seris felt the cold air going deeper into her lungs than it had before, which meant she was breathing differently, shorter, higher in her chest, the breathing of a body registering threat before the mind has finished processing it. She made herself breathe slower, lower. It was a thing you learned when you spent 2 years in the most politically dangerous court in the Northern Territories. The body wants to betray you in high-stakes moments, and you have to be smarter than your own nervous system. "Tell me what war authorization means operationally," she said. "It means he can mobilize the capital armies without council approval for the next 48 hours. Zevrik turned to her. "It means he has legal justification under Ashfang Dominion law to pursue anyone he has flagged as a foreign agent within his territory. And your people inside the citadel. Some of them are technically in violation of Ashfang intelligence protocols," he said. Not apologizing for it, just stating it the way you state a fact about weather. Intelligence work in a rival court occupies a complicated legal position. "So he has grounds. He has declared grounds." Zevrik's voice stayed flat and precise. Whether his evidence is genuine or manufactured is a separate question from whether the legal mechanism can be used, and right now the mechanism is operational. Seris looked at the road north, then at the citadel, then at the soldiers around them, who were watching their commander with the expressions of men who have drilled for contingencies, and are now waiting to find out which one has arrived. Here was the thing nobody prepared you for when you were raised in the kind of household that prepared daughters for political marriages. They taught you protocol and diplomacy and the particular social choreography of court life. They did not teach you what it felt like to be standing in a dark courtyard wearing the ruins of a ceremony in ceremonial silk while 2 empires decided whether to go to war, and you were technically the reason the evening had taken the turn it had taken. She had been thinking about her own survival. That was reasonable. That was appropriate. But survival is a small room if you only think about yourself inside it, and Seris Vaelor had never been built for small rooms. "How many of your people are inside?" she said. "Seris, how many?" He looked at her for a moment. 7. 7 people who were inside the Celestine Citadel right now, while Drazhen Morvain's war authorization lit up the signal fires above his towers. 7 people who had accompanied Zevrik Draven into an enemy court as part of whatever plan had or hadn't anticipated this outcome. "Can they get out?" she said. "They're trained for extraction." "That's not what I asked." He held her gaze. 2 of them are in difficult positions. The inner ward. Getting out of the inner ward once the Capitol Guard activates lockdown takes... He stopped. She watched him make a decision. "It takes time we don't have if we're going to clear the North Pass." Seris looked at the signal fires. Then she looked at Zevrik Draven. This is the thing about that moment that mattered. That would matter, she would understand later, for a long time after. She was looking at a man who had come to the Citadel tonight with a plan and people and a set of outcomes he'd mapped. And the plan had partially unraveled, and the people were in trouble and the outcomes had been revised. And he was sitting on his horse in the dark, and his expression was controlled and his voice was steady, and none of that was what she was reading. What she was reading was in the quality of his silence when she'd asked about the 7 people. He wasn't going to ask her to wait while he went back for them. He was going to tell her they needed to ride north because getting her out of Ashfang territory before the pass closed was the objective, and soldiers understood that sometimes objectives cost things, and he was built from the same iron discipline that produced men who could make those calculations and carry the weight of them afterward. But the calculation cost him something. She could see it, and the fact that it cost him something was the most important information she'd collected all evening. "We go back in," she said. He stared at her. "For your people," she said. "We go back in for the 2 who are stuck." "That is not a rational—" "Probably not," she said. "But you're not leaving 7 people, 2 people, in a citadel where a war authorization just lit up because of a plan you brought them into. That's not who you are." She looked at him steadily. "I've been watching you for the last hour. That is not who you are." Zevrik Draven was very quiet for a very specific amount of time. There is a particular kind of silence that men produce when they have been seen accurately by someone they weren't expecting to be seen by. It isn't comfortable. It isn't the silence of agreement or the silence of dismissal. It's the silence of a person recalibrating their understanding of who they're dealing with. "You have been watching me," he said. "Since you walked through those gates," she said. "You watch people. So do I. Difference is you've had 2 years of reports on me, and I've had 90 minutes of direct observation on you." She gathered her reins. 90 minutes was enough. Something moved at the corners of his expression. "The North Pass closes in under 30 minutes, he said. "Then we need to move fast. Going back into that citadel gets your people out and also puts us back inside the walls before Drazhen's guard fully activates the lockdown," she said. "Because right now the guard response is the outer walls. The inner ward will take another 15 minutes to reach full activation. We have a window and it is closing." She looked at him. "I read the Ashfang capital defense protocols. Drazhen gave me the histories and the military documentation in the first 3 months. I don't think he considered that a liability at the time." Zevrik stared at her for 3 full seconds. Then he said, very quietly, "Which entrance?" And something in Seris Vaelor's chest settled into a kind of steady readiness that she hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. The particular feeling of a person operating at the full edge of their actual capability. No performance, no management, no adjustment for the comfort of others. Just the clean forward motion of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. "The East Servants' Gate," she said. "It runs to the inner ward through the storage corridors. The Capitol Guard uses the ceremonial route for activation response. We have maybe 12 minutes before the storage corridor route gets covered." Zevrik looked at 2 of his soldiers and said 4 words. "Eastgate, 2 minutes." They moved. The thing about going back into a place you just escaped from is that it requires a very specific relationship with fear. Fear in those moments is not useful, and it is also completely unavoidable, so the only option is to let it be there and move anyway, which is something entirely different from courage in the heroic sense. Courage in the heroic sense is the absence of fear. What Seris did as they rode back toward the Citadel's east side was simply refuse to let fear be the loudest thing in the room. Drazhen had given her that. Of all the things he had taken from her, he had also given her that. 2 years in his court had taught her to operate at full function under conditions that would have stopped her dead 2 years earlier. She would not thank him for it, but she would use it. The East Servants' Gate was, as she'd known it would be, underguarded. 2 guards, ceremonially posted, who were looking toward the main gates where the capital defense activation was drawing attention and noise. Zevrik's soldiers were already moving before she'd finished the thought, and then the gate was open and they were inside and the corridors smelled like stone and kitchen smoke and cold winter. "Left," she said, "then right at the supply junction, then straight through to the inner ward east corridor." Zevrik was beside her. "You memorized the servant corridors." "I memorized everything," she said. In case. In case of what?" "In case of exactly this." He looked at her briefly and she couldn't see his expression clearly in the dark of the corridor, but she felt the weight of it and moved on. The inner ward was louder than the corridors. Capital Guard activation was producing the particular institutional chaos of a large security organization receiving orders that are larger than the current situation has yet justified. Men moving with urgency but not quite certainty, the sound of commands being relayed and boots on stone and the metal on metal of armor being checked and rechecked. Zevrik's contact inside was a man named Rael, which was not his real name, and which Seris understood without needing to be told. He was approximately 40, with the build of someone who had spent significant time doing physical work and the eyes of someone who had spent equal time paying close attention to things. He emerged from behind a supply column in the East Inner Ward with the expression of a man who had been calculating exit options for the last 10 minutes and had not been satisfied with any of them. "You came back," Rael said to Zevrik. "We came back," Zevrik said. Rael's eyes moved to Seris. There was an assessment in it that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition. Something between them. "The other one is in the archive passage," Rael said. "He got cut off when the guard activation started on the north side. He went deep." "How deep?" Zevrik said. "Deep enough that getting him out without access credentials is—" Rael stopped, looked at Seris again. "Unless." She understood what the unless meant before he finished it. "You need my authorization mark," she said. The broken mark on her wrist, still faintly luminous, still technically registered in the Ashfang Citadel's access architecture, because legal processing of her status would take days, and the administrative systems didn't move at the speed of rejection ceremonies. "The archive passage access is keyed to bonded or formerly bonded court members," Rael said. His voice was careful and factual. "Your mark would still read as active for however long it takes Drazhen's administration to formally process the severance," she said, "which it hasn't had time to do tonight." "Yes." She looked at Zevrik. He was looking at her with that expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that said he was watching her make a decision and was not going to interfere with it, which was itself a kind of respect that felt different from every other kind of respect she'd encountered in 2 years of court life. "Show me the archive passage," she said to Rael. They moved through the inner ward with the particular movement of people who need to be fast without looking like they need to be fast, which is one of the hardest physical performances available to human beings and requires the kind of training that most people don't get. Seris's ceremonial silk was a problem, too visible, too specific, too obviously associated with tonight's events, and she solved it by grabbing a plain wool overcloak from a supply rack in the corridor they passed through and pulling it on over everything. Practical. Immediate. Done. Zevrik noticed, said nothing, filed it. The archive passage access point was a door in the lower inner ward that looked like a storage entrance because it was also a storage entrance, and the guard posted beside it was doing his job with the distracted energy of someone who is aware that bigger things are happening elsewhere in the Citadel and is struggling to find his posting relevant. Seris walked to the door with the deliberate pace of someone who belongs there. She raised her wrist. The broken mark flickered against the access point. 1 second. 2. The lock released. She pushed through without looking at the guard and felt Zevrik and Rael move in behind her and let the door close and breathed in the cold dark of the archive passage, which smelled like old stone and parchment and the particular dust of records nobody had looked at in decades. "Third left," Rael said quietly. "He should be at the junction." They found him at the junction. Zevrik's other man was younger than Rael, darker-haired, with a cut above his left eyebrow that he hadn't had time to deal with and was choosing to ignore. He looked at Zevrik with the expression of a soldier seeing his commanding officer after a close call. Relief managed down to professional acknowledgement. Because soldiers don't perform relief, they store it for later. "Extraction," Zevrik said. "Ready," the young man said. They moved. What happened in the next 9 minutes was the kind of thing that doesn't make for good storytelling because it required absolute focus and absolute silence, and the exclusion of everything except the immediate next step, which is precisely why it works in reality and feels thin in narrative. They moved through the archive passage to the secondary exit point that Rael had identified earlier, which opened into the outer causeway approach through a drainage access that smelled exactly as bad as it sounds. They came out into cold air and darkness. All of them. All 7. Seris stood in the dark outside the Celestine Citadel for the second time that evening, and felt the particular exhaustion of a body that has been running on acute stress for an extended period and is beginning to register the debt. She didn't allow it, not yet. Zevrik was beside her. He was looking at the signal fires still burning on the towers and doing some kind of calculation that she could see working in the set of his jaw. "The North Pass," she said. 17 minutes, he said. "Can we make it?" "Not on this road." He looked at her. "There's a secondary route, older. The garrison maps don't cover it comprehensively. It adds distance, but removes the checkpoints." "The garrison maps that Drazhen's Capital Guard are using tonight." "Yes." She looked at the road. Here was the thing she was thinking about as they moved toward the horses that Zevrik's remaining soldiers had held in the outer darkness while the extraction happened. She was thinking about Drazhen Morvain standing inside his citadel with his war authorization and his signal fires and his carefully constructed architecture of tonight's events. She was thinking about what Zevrik had said, that he had planned for her to leave with a rival king, that the legal structure of the bond severance was designed to give him a reinitiation option, that she had walked into an architecture prepared before she arrived. She was thinking about what it meant that he had gone to that level of preparation. Power rarely shows you its full hand. The visible display, the rejection, the ceremony, the public humiliation, those were the pieces Drazhen wanted seen. The pieces he wanted unseen were the mechanism underneath, the legal architecture, the intelligence setup that brought Zevrik to the Citadel through controlled channels, the war authorization staged and ready to deploy. He hadn't just planned tonight. He had planned the next 6 months, which meant Seris Vaelor leaving with Zevrik Draven was not the worst outcome for Drazhen Morvain. It was the intended outcome. Controlled departure, known destination, a legal mechanism in his pocket that he could activate when the timing suited him. She was riding into the Nightclaw Imperium not because she had broken free. She was riding into the Nightclaw Imperium because Drazhen Morvain had decided that was where she should go. She let the thought settle fully. Let it be as dark as it was, because there was no point in softening the things that were true. Softening truth was how you ended up surprised by it later, when the surprise was far more expensive. Then she started thinking about what you do with that truth. They rode. The secondary route was older and the road surface showed it, uneven stone and stretches of packed earth that the horses navigated with the careful attention of animals that understand their footing matters. The night was dark enough that the mountain cold felt tactile, something you moved through rather than something you wore. Seris rode beside Zevrik, and the silence between them was different from earlier silences. Denser, more layered, full of things that hadn't been said yet because there hadn't been space to say them. She said them now. "He wanted this," she said. "You told me he engineered your arrival, but he also engineered the departure." Zevrik didn't look at her right away. He was watching the road. When he did look at her, she could see that he'd already arrived at the same destination. "Yes," he said. "You knew." "I suspected it during the extraction," he said. "The war authorization signal was too fast, too clean. It had the structure of a prepared response rather than an improvised one. Which means the intelligence that brought you to the Citadel tonight, the controlled channels you mentioned. He wasn't just allowing your arrival, he was managing your arrival. He knew your contact inside. He may have fed your contact the information about tonight's ceremony deliberately." Zevrik's jaw tightened. That was new. She'd seen him process difficult information several times in the last hour, and he'd processed it with remarkable steadiness. The jaw tightening was the first sign of something moving beneath the surface that wasn't fully controlled. "Your source inside the Ashfang Council," she said. "Is it possible Drazhen turned them?" The silence lasted several seconds. "It is possible," he said, "which means the information about the bond severance being reinitiation capable, the information about the architecture of tonight's plan. May be true," he said, "or may have been designed to be delivered to me so I would deliver it to you." She let that sit. Here's the thing about being systematically manipulated by someone you have trusted. And Seris had been in proximity to Drazhen long enough to understand the specific quality of his intelligence. It doesn't produce the simple fury that stories suggest it should. It produces something colder and more complicated. A kind of exhausted respect for the sophistication of the architecture, combined with the particular kind of anger that arrives when you realize someone has been treating your existence as a chess piece for longer than you knew. She was angry. Not in the hot, urgent way that makes people say things they can't take back. In the slow, thorough way that becomes a reliable fuel source. If his source inside your network was turned, she said, then he knows where we're going. He knows we're going to the Nightclaw Imperium, Zevrik said. The specific entry route, the border arrangements, the interior destination, those require levels of intelligence he would not have had time to develop if the source was only recently turned. Or he developed them earlier and is letting us believe we have more operational security than we do. Zevrik looked at her. You think in contingencies, he said. I learned it from watching him, she said. The road curved north and the mountains rose ahead of them, darker than the sky, immovable in the way that things are immovable when they predate every human concern entirely. She found the mountains clarifying. They didn't care about Drazhen Morvain or crown bond severances or the political architecture of rival empires. They had been here before all of it, and they would be here after, and sometimes that kind of perspective was useful. Here's what I want to say to you, Seris said. Zevrik waited. I don't know what you want from this situation, she said. I don't know what I represent in your calculations. Opportunity, asset, liability, something more complicated than any of those categories. I don't know whether you came to that citadel for the reasons you told me or for reasons that would be uncomfortable, if stated plainly. I don't know how much of tonight has been your plan and how much has been Drazhen's plan wearing your clothes. She paused. I'm also aware that I am currently on a horse in the dark in ceremonial silk with a broken bond mark on my wrist and no legal standing in any territory we're likely to reach in the next 48 hours. And my options for something other than trusting you right now are limited in ways that make genuine trust almost impossible to verify. Zevrik said nothing. So I'm going to say this once, she said, and I mean it the way I mean everything, which is completely, without performance. If I discover that you've been managing me the way he managed me, the consequences will be specific and they will be mine to decide. Not a threat, an accurate statement of how I operate. She looked at him across the dark road. Are we clear? The silence lasted long enough that she felt the temperature of it. Then, we're clear. Good. And for what it's worth, he said, tell me what I said in the Citadel about why I came, the 2 years of watching you through reports and diplomatic correspondence. That was true. All of it. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. I have been in this position of sovereign authority for 11 years. In 11 years, the number of people who have spoken to me the way you spoke tonight can be counted on one hand. He paused. The number who were correct in what they said is smaller than that. She absorbed it. What did I say that was correct? She said. That I was not going to leave my people behind. His voice was very level. I had made the calculation, and it was the wrong calculation, and I knew it was wrong while I was making it. You called it accurately in about 90 seconds of direct observation. He glanced at her. That is either extraordinary perceptiveness or I am more readable than I thought. Neither possibility is entirely comfortable. Both can be true, she said. Yes, he said. Both can be true. They rode in silence for a while. The mountains grew closer. The signal fires were no longer visible behind them, which meant the citadel was below the horizon, which meant the road had taken them far enough that Drazhen Morvain's towers were for the moment out of sight. It was not the same as being out of reach, and she knew it, and he knew it, and neither of them said it because stating the obvious is rarely useful, and they were both too tired and too alert and too many layered in their current situation for the obvious. What she thought about instead was Viarel Thorn. She thought about the woman in the gallery with her careful, composed silence and her satisfied expression and the specific position she occupied in Drazhen's architecture. Not just a political consort, not just a frontier alliance. Something more structural, someone who had spent enough time in proximity to Drazhen Morvain to understand how his long-game thinking worked and had positioned herself inside it. Seris had been trying for the last several hours to understand what Viarel Thorn actually was in this situation. The obvious answer was rival. The obvious answer was also almost certainly incomplete, because Drazhen Morvain did not make simple decisions, and anyone who occupied a central position in his planning was there for reasons that went beyond the simple. Tell me what you know about Viarel Thorn, she said. Zevrik's posture shifted very slightly. Why? He said. Because she was too quiet tonight, Seris said. I've dealt with enough high-level political operatives to know what deliberate silence looks like versus the silence of someone who's simply observing. She was performing stillness, which means she was managing something, which means she had information that required management. She's been Drazhen's primary political consort for 8 months, Zevrik said. Her family controls the Red Claw frontier access, 3 generations of border territory management. She is intelligent, thorough, and operates with a long planning horizon. I know the official profile, Seris said. What does your intelligence say that the official profile doesn't? Another silence. She has been in communication with 3 foreign courts over the last 4 months, Zevrik said. Not just Drazhen's allied territories, foreign courts, including... He stopped. She looked at him. Including yours, she said. He didn't answer immediately. She felt the cold air and the dark and the sound of horses on old stone, and she thought very carefully about the shape of what she was looking at. If Viral Thorn had been in communication with the Nightclaw Imperium for 4 months, and if the intelligence that drew Zevrik to tonight's ceremony had come through a potentially turned source, and if Drazhen had staged tonight with a level of preparation that suggested months of planning, she was the contact, Seris said. Zevrik was very still. Viral Thorn was your source, Seris said, inside the Ashfang court. She was the one who fed you the information about tonight's ceremony. The horses moved through the dark. That's who Drazhen turned, she said, or didn't need to turn, because she was working for him already and working for you simultaneously, and the information she fed you was designed to bring you to the Citadel exactly when you arrived. She could hear her own voice working through it, the particular speed of understanding something large in real time. She's not Drazhen's ally, she's his instrument, and she's been playing your network from inside it for at minimum 4 months. Zevrik said, yes. 1 word, flat and clean. She stared at him. You knew, she said. I suspected it, he said, during the extraction when the architecture became clear. I suspected it. I wasn't certain. But you didn't tell me. I was working through it. While I was working through it and you were watching me work through it, and you could have given me the piece that made the picture complete, but instead you... She stopped, made herself breathe. You were testing what I'd arrive at on my own. He didn't deny it. Why? She said. Because I needed to know how fast you move through complex information under pressure without assistance, he said. And I needed to know if you'd arrive at the same conclusions I did or different ones. Either answer would be useful. Seris looked at the road ahead. This is the thing about Zevrik Draven that she was beginning to understand with the thorough clarity of someone who has been paying close attention. He was not cruel. Cruelty requires a certain disregard for the person being damaged, a fundamental decision that their experience is irrelevant to your purposes. And Zevrik Draven was not built that way. He was careful, precise. He gathered information through the closest available means, and sometimes the closest available means was the person riding beside him, and he used that without apology because not using it would be its own kind of inefficiency. It made him simultaneously more trustworthy than Drazhen had ever been, and more dangerous in ways that were harder to map. Because cruelty you can see coming. Precision is invisible until it's already operated on you. She was going to need to think very carefully about what that meant for the road ahead. Viral Thorn has been in communication with 3 foreign courts, she said. You said including yours. Which others? The Western Thornfield territories, he said, and the Vaelor's Eastern family holdings. She went completely still. The mountain wind came down and the horses moved and the night was enormous around them, and she sat in it and felt the shape of what he had just said. My family, she said. The Eastern holdings specifically. Your cousin Aldrich Vaelor's administration. Zevrik's voice was careful and precise, and she recognized that carefulness as the thing it was. Not kindness, but accuracy being delivered with attention to how it lands. 4 months of correspondence. The content of that correspondence is partially documented. It includes references to a planned transition of certain Eastern Territory management rights contingent on the resolution of the Crown Bond situation. Seris's hands on the reins were very still. Aldrich knew, she said. It appears he was informed, Zevrik said, of the broad outlines, not necessarily the specific date or mechanism. But he knew the bond was going to be severed. He knew a transition was planned, Zevrik said. He appears to have positioned himself to benefit from it. She breathed in, out, long and deliberate. Her cousin Aldrich had been the family member she had maintained the closest correspondence with during 2 years at Drazhen's court. He had been her connection to the Vaelor family, her source of information about the Eastern holdings, her sense that there were people outside the Ashfang political machinery who were simply family and therefore could be trusted in the uncomplicated way that family should be trustworthy. He had known, not the specific night, not the exact ceremony, but the arc of it, the plan for the bond to end, the expected benefit to the Eastern holdings, the positioning for whatever came after. He had known, and he had written to her every 3rd week about the harvest yields and the estate management and the family news, and not once had he said a single word. She held that knowledge, didn't try to soften it, didn't try to find an interpretation that made it less than what it was, just held it fully and let it be the thing it was. "Thank you," she said. Zevrik looked at her. "For telling me," she said, "even if the timing of how you told me was a test." "The information was real," he said. "The timing was a test," she said. "I know. I'm not angry about it." "You were a moment ago." "I was a moment ago about the betrayal thorn piece," she said. "This one I understand differently. Aldrich is mine. That information belongs to me. You had it, and you gave it to me, and the how of it matters less than the fact of it." He was quiet for a moment. "You separate things efficiently," he said. "I had good training," she said. They crested the secondary route's highest point, and the mountain range spread before them, enormous and cold and indifferent, and below them in the dark, the border territory between the Ashfang Dominion and the Nightclaw Imperium lay in folds of valley and ridge that looked, from this altitude, like something that didn't care about borders at all. She looked at it. Then she heard the horses behind them, not their horses. Different horses. Coming from below and behind, from the direction of the main road, which intersected the secondary route 3 miles back. Coming fast. Zevrik heard it at the same moment. His hand went up and the whole column stopped on the mountain ridge in complete silence. They listened. The horses were closing. Fast. More than a small patrol. The sound was too broad, too evenly distributed. A company of mounted soldiers moving at pursuit speed. He knew the secondary route, Seris said, or found it fast. Zevrik was already making decisions that she could see in the way he was looking at the terrain. 2 minutes before they reach us. The border. 3 miles. She did the mathematics and didn't like it. "We can't outride them on this terrain," she said. "No. And we can't fight a mounted company with 7 soldiers and a woman in ceremonial silk. No." She looked at the terrain, then at the border, then at the route between them and it. "There's a way," she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the ridgeline to the east of their position. "The Ashfang garrison maps don't cover the secondary route comprehensively. You said that. They also don't cover the eastern ridge crossings. I know because the mapping project for those crossings was one of the administrative items on my review list for the coming year. Unfinished. Budget dispute between the Frontier Garrison Command and the Council's Territory Office. You're going to navigate us across an unmapped ridge crossing in the dark," he said. "I'm going to navigate us across a ridge crossing that I read about in 3 historical survey documents from the Territorial Archives," she said, "which I accessed during the administrative work I was doing for Drazhen's Eastern Border Policy Review, which he gave me access to because he trusted my competence, which was one of his accurate assessments." She looked at Zevrik. "I know those mountains better than whoever is behind us. Question is whether you trust that." The horses behind them were close enough now that she could hear individual hoofbeats resolving out of the general thunder. Zevrik looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. Then he looked at his soldiers. "East Ridge," he said. "She leads." They moved. The ridge crossing was exactly where the historical survey documents had said it would be, which was both satisfying and terrifying, and she moved through it on instinct and remembered detail and the particular focus of someone who has decided that uncertainty is not an option right now, and has therefore temporarily reclassified it as something else. They came down the eastern side of the ridge as the pursuing company reached the secondary route behind them and stopped. She could hear the sounds of a mounted company encountering a fork in the route and losing the trail, the particular acoustics of confusion at distance. Then the border markers. Old stone, carved with the territorial demarcations of a border agreement written 70 years ago and revised twice since. She knew the legal language of the most recent revision because she had processed the diplomatic correspondence around it during her second year at Drazhen's court. She crossed the marker first, then Zevrik, then his soldiers. She pulled her horse to a stop on the Nightclaw Imperium side of the border and turned back to look at the mountains they'd come through and felt the exhaustion arrive properly now, full and thorough, the debt coming due. Behind her, Ashfang territory. Drazhen's signal fires. A cousin who had known. A legal mechanism in a king's pocket. An architecture designed months in advance. Beside her, Zevrik Draven, who had come to her humiliation and gotten her out and told her hard truths in a specific order for reasons she was still mapping, and who was watching her face right now with the expression she had come to recognize as his version of paying close attention. "What happens next?" she said. "We ride to the Nightclaw interior," he said. "You establish legal standing under Imperium guest right. The political situation stabilizes before—" "I mean what happens between you and me," she said, "in terms of what this is." He was quiet. "Because I need to know," she said. "Not the diplomatic answer, not the answer designed for the court or the political record. I need to know what you think I am in your situation. Asset, alliance, problem you're managing, something else." She looked at him across the dark. "Because I am done. Entirely done. Completely finished. With being a variable in someone else's calculation without knowing I'm in it." The mountain wind moved between them. Zevrik Draven looked at her for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it yet. Not softer, exactly. Reduced. Like a man who has taken down a layer of something he usually maintains. "Honest answer," he said. "Only answer I want. When I started receiving reports on you 18 months ago," he said, "you were a political intelligence item, a variable in an Ashfang succession calculation. I tracked you because tracking the people around rival kings is how you survive as a king." He paused. "Somewhere in the last 6 months, the reports became something I read for reasons that were not entirely strategic." He kept his eyes on her. "I don't have clean language for that. I am not a man who has been particularly careful about developing the vocabulary for the interior things. But I am also not going to dress it as something other than what it is." Seris held his gaze. "That's an honest answer," she said. "Yes. It's also very complicated." "Yes," he said. "It is." She turned her horse south toward the interior of the Nightclaw Imperium, away from the border, away from the mountains. Then she stopped, because the rider who came over the eastern ridge behind them was alone and moving fast, and wore Ashfang courier colors, and carried a sealed dispatch that caught the moonlight with the distinctive red wax of an Imperial emergency communication. The rider pulled up 20 feet inside the Nightclaw border, which was itself a significant violation, and looked at Zevrik Draven and held out the dispatch. "From King Alpha Drazhen Morvain," the rider said, "to be delivered into the hands of King Alpha Zevrik Draven and Lady Seris Vaelor, both, together." The silence on the mountain border was total. He had known they would arrive here together. He had sent this before they crossed. Zevrik looked at Seris. She looked at the dispatch, and she understood, with the cold certainty of a woman who has just finished understanding the full architecture of what she's inside, that whatever was in that sealed message had not been written in anger or in response to tonight's events. It had been written in advance. It had been waiting, and whatever it said was going to change every calculation she had just made. The dispatch sat in Zevrik's hand for 3 seconds before he broke the seal. Seris watched his face the way she had been watching faces all evening, for the thing underneath the thing, for what expression produces before the mind has time to edit it. She had gotten very good at this in 2 years of court life. She had gotten considerably better at it in the last 4 hours. What she saw on Zevrik Draven's face as his eyes moved across that document was something she had not seen there yet. Not calculation, not controlled processing, not the composed certainty of a man who has planned for multiple outcomes. She saw a man encountering something he had not planned for. He read it twice. One full pass, then a return to the top, slower. When he lowered the document, his jaw was set in a different way than she'd seen before. Not the tightening of suppressed anger, but the stillness of a man holding something in his mouth that he does not want to say. He handed it to her without speaking. She read it. The first thing she registered was the handwriting, not a court scribe. Drazhen's own hand, the particular compression of his letters, the harder pressure on final syllables, the handwriting of a man who had written orders and treaties for 20 years and never let another hand represent his authority on a page that mattered. This mattered. The dispatch opened without ceremony. It read, "By the time you read this, you will have crossed into Nightclaw territory together. I know this because I know Zevrik Draven's decision-making architecture, and I know Seris Vaelor's, and the intersection produces one outcome. I am not writing to stop you. I am writing to clarify something that will become relevant within 72 hours. What is coming for the Nightclaw Imperium is not coming because of tonight. It has been building for 7 months. My intelligence network has documented a coordinated destabilization campaign targeting Nightclaw's eastern territories, funded by the Thornfield Western Coalition. The campaign reaches into Zevrik Draven's inner council. One of his 3 senior commanders is compromised. I do not know which one. I know what it costs to tell you this. I am telling you anyway. You will decide what to do with it." Seris lowered the dispatch. She looked at the mountains, at the border marker, at the courier already turning his horse back toward Ashfang territory, wanting no further involvement in whatever happened next. Then she looked at Zevrik. "You've already processed it," she said. "Started," he said. "The Thornfield Coalition," she said, "your eastern territories. They've been moving against my eastern line for longer than 7 months," he said. The flatness in his voice was the specific flatness of someone compressing something enormous into a very small container. "I had intelligence on the edges, nothing that pointed toward an inner council compromise." He paused. "Rael." Rael straightened on his horse. "Sir." "Caddock, Marin, Ferris, last 7 months. Any anomalies?" Rael's face moved through several things quickly. "Ferris has been handling Eastern Garrison reports personally for 4 months, outside his normal scope. I flagged it low priority because the garrison commander in Eastrock had been ill." "But," Zevrik said. "The garrison commander recovered 2 months ago," Rael said. "Ferris kept handling the reports himself." The silence that followed had weight. Here is the thing about betrayal from within. Real betrayal. Not the abstract political kind, but the specific kind that comes from someone placed close and trusted with actual access. It doesn't arrive as dramatic revelation. It arrives as clarification. As the moment when several things that didn't quite fit suddenly fit perfectly, and the fitting is worse than the confusion was, because confusion at least left room for alternate explanations. Rael had noted it, flagged it low priority, moved on. That is how it works. Betrayal from the inside gives itself reasonable justifications. It lives in the space between what you know and what you can prove, and it survives there because proof is expensive and trust is efficient, and efficient systems always have exploitable gaps. "How long have you known Ferris?" Seris said. Zevrik looked at her. 8 years. She didn't say anything. 8 years was its own sentence. "We move," Zevrik said. "And when we reach the interior, the first thing we do is test this. You tell Rael which commander you're contacting first about the Eastern Garrison situation," Seris said. "Only Rael. Then we watch what moves." Zevrik looked at her for 1 second, then at Rael. "Ride," he said. They rode south into the Nightclaw Imperium as the sky went from black to dark blue to the particular gray that arrives before actual morning. Seris rode and thought about the dispatch, about what it meant that Drazhen had sent it, about the question she could not resolve with the information she had, whether this was genuine intelligence delivered at personal political cost, or the most sophisticated piece of the architecture yet, designed to insert her into Zevrik's operations as a carrier of information Drazhen wanted delivered. She could not determine it, and not being able to determine it was itself a kind of trap. They reached a border garrison settlement at the edge of morning. Zevrik arranged rooms briefly, and Seris stood alone in a plain, cold space looking at the broken bond mark on her wrist in gray light coming through a narrow window, still faintly luminous. Another day, maybe 2, before administrative processing completed, and it went dark. 2 days of access credentials Drazhen no longer intended her to have. She thought about what she could do with that. Then she got up, found plain working clothes in the storage chest, too large in the shoulders, too short in the leg, therefore perfect, and walked out toward the stables. Zevrik was already there. He looked at her with the expression she was beginning to catalog as his version of painful attention. He was also in plain clothes that fit slightly wrong. She almost said something about it and didn't. "The Eastern Intelligence Cache," she said. 4 miles back toward the border. I can access it. You can't." "I know where it is," he said. "I've tracked 5 Ashfang cache locations over 3 years. Then you know I'm going to verify whether this dispatch is real or constructed." "Yes," he said, "which is why I'm coming with you." She looked at him for a moment. 2 horses, she said. Fast. The cache presented as a grain storage facility on the Ashfang side of the border, unremarkable in the way of things built to be unremarkable, and effective at it. Seris moved to it on foot from the north, while Zevrik held the horses in the tree line, and the access point read her broken mark without hesitation because the administrative processing hadn't caught up to the ceremony yet. Inside, she read fast. The Thornfield documentation was real. 7 months of field reports, contact records, financial transaction summaries. Genuine intelligence work, the kind that took months and careful sources and the particular patience of professional networks. Thorough enough that manufacturing it would have required infrastructure nearly as large as the original operation. She found Ferris, not by name, by contact code, the field designation used when networks don't commit names to cache-level documentation. The code linked to a position descriptor specific enough to narrow the field dramatically. Senior Command, Eastern Theater, Nightclaw Imperium. Active cooperation since month 4 of the campaign. 4 months. Matching exactly what Rael had noted. She stood in that cold space and understood that Drazhen's dispatch was real, which required her to understand why he had sent it. Here is what she had spent 2 years trying to fully resolve about Drazhen Morvain, and what she finally resolved in an Ashfang intelligence cache at the edge of morning. He was not simply a calculating man. Calculation was what he showed. What drove the calculation was fear. Not the small kind, not fear of physical danger or political opposition, but the large fear that powerful men sometimes carry without acknowledging it. Fear that the thing he had built was more contingent than it appeared. That one wrong move would reveal the whole structure as dependent on conditions that could change. That fear had driven him to send this dispatch, because Drazhen Morvain genuinely did not want the Nightclaw Imperium collapsing from within. Not from goodness, from strategic reality. A collapsed rival created a border vacuum he didn't want. Stable enemies were manageable. Chaos wasn't. He had sent it because it served his interests. He had sent it through her because that also served his interests. And it was still real. Both things simultaneously and completely true. She put the documentation back in precise order and walked out with what she needed in her memory instead of her hands, because taking documents across a border was a different order of violation than reading them. Zevrik read her face when she reached the tree line. "Real," he said. "Ferris. Contact code matches his position and timeline. 4 months. Something moved through his face that had no clean name. Too disciplined for full betrayal shock, but the thing underneath the discipline was visible in the set of his eyes, in the stillness that arrived when a man is processing the discovery that 8 years of trusted proximity has been running a counter-operation for 4 months. 8 years. That duration was the weight of it. Not a casual acquaintance. Someone who had ridden with him, planned with him, shared the specific intimacy of men who survive difficult operations together and come out still standing. That kind of relationship becomes bedrock. You stop evaluating it as trust because it has become so foundational that questioning it feels like questioning the ground beneath your feet. Ferris had understood that, had used it. They sent the contact request. They waited. Ferris arrived at mid-morning with 2 guards and the bearing of a senior commander who has managed difficult situations before and expects to manage this one. He pulled up 30 feet out and looked at Zevrik with professional calm. Then his eyes moved to Seris. There it was. The rapid recalculation. The flicker of a man whose internal model of the situation has just encountered a variable that doesn't fit. She was not supposed to be here. She was supposed to be deep in the Nightclaw interior, far from the border, far from any Ashfang intelligence infrastructure. She was at the border, with an expression that told him she knew something. "Commander Ferris," Zevrik said, completely steady. The specific steadiness of controlled fury which sounds almost like calm but has different weight. Tell me about the Eastern Garrison reports. The silence that followed was its own form of confession. Seris recovered in under 2 seconds, but the 2 seconds were there. I've been handling those personally since Commander Aldous was ill. Aldous recovered 2 months ago, Zevrik said. The transition back to standard protocol has been gradual. Continuity concerns. Seris, Zevrik's voice dropped. Not louder, lower. I've known you 8 years. The sentence landed like a door closing. Seris went very still. This is the thing about betrayal being named by someone with 8 years of earned authority behind the naming. An enemy confronting you can be dismissed as attack, as politics. A man who stood beside you in the Eastern campaigns and trusted you with senior command naming your betrayal is something different. It is a mirror. The Thornfield Coalition has been in your Eastern Garrison reports for 4 months, Zevrik said. The documentation exists, your contact code, the transaction records. He held Ferris's gaze. Explain it. Seris looked at him for a long time. The mining access renegotiation 7 years ago, Seris said finally. Something in his command register had aged visibly. I told you then that excluding Thornfield entirely would cost us eventually. You disagreed with the decision. I told you it was a mistake. And your response to my decision that you disagreed with, Zevrik said, was to sell my Eastern defensive line to the people who wanted it removed. I was managing a situation I believed your decisions had made inevitable, without telling me. Because telling you would have what? The quiet in Zevrik's voice was absolute. Required you to make a case instead of making decisions for me. Seris looked at him. There was nothing left to say that would change what it was. Get off your horse, Zevrik said. You'll be remanded to the border garrison for processing. The Eastern Command transfers immediately. The Thornfield documentation goes to independent tribunal. Seris dismounted. He didn't run, didn't argue. He descended from his horse with the specific resignation of a man who has reached the end of a road he chose himself and is old enough to understand he chose it. Seris watched it happen and thought about what it cost Zevrik to manage those words with that precision while absorbing what they meant. 8 years resolving into this. Any lesser man would have let the fury show. Zevrik didn't, not because he wasn't feeling it, but because he understood that the moment required clarity, more than it required him to be witnessed in his pain. That was the distinction. That was what made him what he was. When Rael moved Seris back toward the garrison and the situation had been contained into its next phase, Zevrik walked to where Seris stood in the tree line. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Drazhen's dispatch was real, she said. Yes. He knew about Seris and sent it through me, she said, which means he has assets inside your network that run deeper than Varel Thorn's contact. 7 months of documentation requires infrastructure. He's been inside your network for at minimum 7 months. Zevrik was quiet. She said the thing she'd been working toward since she'd stood in that cache. He didn't discard me, she said. He placed me. The silence was absolute. You're the asset, Zevrik said. Not accusing, diagnosing. I don't know that, she said. I genuinely cannot tell you whether I'm in his network or whether he expected this outcome through my independent choices or whether both things are true simultaneously. She held his gaze. What I know is that I spent 2 years inside the most sophisticated intelligence architecture in the Northern Territories, and I cannot tell you with certainty how much of tonight was mine. Zevrik looked at her for a long time. This was the moment. She understood it fully, trust or don't. Believe she was here through her own choices or believe she was a placed asset. Both options had evidence. Neither could be definitively proved with what was available. And he had just watched 8 years of trusted command produce 4 months of betrayal. You went into the cache to verify the documentation before you told me what you found, he said. Yes. You could have told me it was real without verifying it, he said. I would have proceeded. You verified it because you needed to know whether the intelligence was accurate before you used it. Not for my sake, for the quality of the information itself. She waited. An asset operating on someone else's direction doesn't do that, he said. An asset delivers the message and manages the outcome. Verification creates the risk of finding something that complicates delivery. You're not his asset. He paused. You might be the outcome he planned for. That's different. You can be someone's planned outcome and still be entirely your own person operating by your own judgment. She breathed. Then she said, if I find evidence, real evidence, that I've been operating inside his network without knowing it, I will tell you, immediately, without managing the implications first, because I am not willing to be what Ferris was to you. I'm not willing to let whatever this becomes be the thing that makes me conceal what I should give you. He held her gaze. I know, he said. You can't know that. You've known me 12 hours. I know it, he said, because you just said it when you didn't have to. She turned toward the horses. Then she stopped. The rider coming over the northern ridge wore the specific gray and black of the Vaelor family Eastern holdings, the crest she had grown up with, the horse colors she had ridden behind as a child. Not a messenger. Aldrich himself, her cousin, who had known, who had corresponded with Virel Thorn across 4 months, who had positioned himself to benefit from her destruction while writing her warm weekly letters about harvest yields and family news and the minor accumulations of a life that had been performing itself as trustworthy. He pulled up and looked at her. She looked at him. In the space between them was every letter, every week, every carefully maintained warmth written with knowledge he had chosen not to share. And Seris understood that whatever Aldrich said next, whatever justification he had ridden through the night to deliver, something had already been decided. Not by the night, not by Drazhen, not by any architecture anyone else had built, by her. The woman standing on this mountain border was not the woman who had ascended the moon oath dais in white ceremonial silk 24 hours ago. That woman had still believed, in some deep and unexamined place, that the people positioned close to her were there because proximity meant something. That warmth was evidence of loyalty. That connection, maintained across distance, was real in the way that mattered. She did not believe that anymore. Not bitterly, not with the fragile brittleness of a person who has been hurt and hardened against hurt, but with the clear-eyed understanding of someone who has learned that warmth and betrayal are not opposites, that a person can be genuinely fond of you and still choose their interests over yours when the calculation turns. And that understanding this is not cynicism. It is the price of operating in the world as it actually is, rather than as you need it to be. Aldrich opened his mouth. Seris, don't, she said. He stopped. I don't want the explanation yet, she said. Not here, not now. She looked at him with the full weight of everything the night had taught her. You're going to come with us into the Nightclaw interior. You're going to sit across from me in a room with no audience and no political positioning available to either of us, and you're going to tell me everything. Every communication with Virel Thorn, every conversation with Drazhen's people, every piece of information you had that you chose not to give me. She paused. And then I'm going to decide what I am to you after that, not before. Aldrich looked at her. She saw on his face the thing she had expected to feel herself, and didn't. The grief, the visible weight of a man who has ridden through the night and arrived at the consequence of his choices, and found the consequence real in a way that calculation had not made real. You knew, he said. Not denial, statement. I found the documentation this morning, she said. He was quiet for a long moment. Seris, what Drazhen offered the Eastern holdings. I said not here, she said. He stopped. She turned to her horse. Zevrik was already mounted, watching her with the expression she had catalogued as paying close attention, and she knew he had heard all of it and was not going to comment on any of it, which was the correct instinct, and she noted it. We ride, she said. She swung into the saddle and looked at the road south, at the Nightclaw Imperium opening up below the mountain line, at the cold morning light making everything flat and clear and without sentiment. Behind her, Drazhen's citadel, the broken bond, a legal mechanism in a king's pocket, waiting. Beside her, Zevrik Draven, whose empire had a traitor in it that she had helped uncover, whose trust she had not yet earned and had not yet betrayed, whose interior she was riding toward with working access she'd asked for and been given. Behind her, Aldrich, who had known, and who was coming anyway, and who would sit across from her in a room with no audience and tell her things she was not sure she wanted to hear, but needed to. And underneath all of it, the question she still could not answer. How much of where she was standing had she chosen? How much had been chosen for her? And whether the difference mattered as much as what she chose to do from here? She rode south and let the question stay open, because closing it prematurely was the kind of thing that got people killed, and she intended to be very much alive for what came next. The Nightclaw interior arrived the way power arrives, gradually and then without warning all at once. They rode through the afternoon and into the early evening, and the territory changed around them in increments that Seris catalogued without appearing to catalogue, reading the landscape the way she read faces, for what was present and what was conspicuously absent. Maintained roads, garrison settlements spaced with intentional regularity, supply infrastructure that told her the empire had been managed by someone who understood that logistics was strategy, and strategy was survival. She filed it. She filed everything. The conversation with Aldrich did not happen on the road. There was no space for it on the road. Too many ears, too many variables in motion, too much operational pressure from the Ferris situation and the Thornfield network documentation that lived in her memory and needed to be formalized before it degraded in usefulness. She rode and Aldrich rode 20 feet behind her, and neither of them spoke to each other, and the distance between them was not merely physical. She would deal with him. She would sit across from him in a room and hear what he had to say, and she would deal with it on the terms she had named at the border. Completely, without performance, without the managed calm of a woman protecting herself from full impact. She had learned that lesson the hard way over 2 years in Drazhen's court. Managed distance from painful truth does not protect you from it. It only delays the accounting while the interest compounds. But first, there was the Thornfield network. They reached the Nightclaw operational center at the edge of night, not the capital, not yet, but the eastern administrative hub from which the garrison command structure radiated. A substantial facility, not beautiful, built for function with the particular aesthetic of places that have never had time to be anything but what they needed to be. Zevrik moved through it with the ease of a man in his own infrastructure, which was clarifying in the way that watching people in their native environment is always clarifying. He was a different quality of presence here. Not larger. He had taken up a specific kind of space in every environment she'd seen him in. Different, less performed. She noted it and kept moving. The working room they gave her was plain and well lit and had the documents she needed brought to her within 30 minutes of her request, which told her something about how seriously Zevrik was taking the Ferris situation, and by extension the intelligence she'd carried across the border in her memory. She worked. For 3 hours, she cross-referenced what she'd read in the Ashfang cache against the Eastern Garrison reports that Ferris had been submitting personally for 4 months. The pattern that emerged was meticulous and damning, a systematic modification of troop positioning data that created the appearance of a well-defended eastern line while quietly redistributing actual defensive capacity away from the 3 key access points the Thornfield Coalition would need to exploit for their pressure campaign. It was sophisticated work. She had to give Ferris that. Not the brutish kind of betrayal, the kind that required only nerve. This required sustained intelligence and a thorough understanding of how the reports would be read, which meant Ferris had spent 4 months maintaining perfect professional surface while operating a counter-architecture underneath it. She understood it. It made her sick that she understood it so well. She was 3 hours into the documentation when Rael knocked on the doorframe. "There's a situation," he said. She looked up. His face had the specific economy of a soldier delivering bad news with maximum compression. Thornfield moved up their timeline. We're getting border intelligence from the East Rock garrison, the real garrison, the officers Ferris hadn't flipped, that a Thornfield military column is 12 hours out from the eastern access point. They weren't supposed to move for another 3 weeks. Seris put down her work. "Ferris warned them," she said. "Before we got to him," Rael said. "He had an emergency contact protocol. We found it after the fact. He triggered it this morning when he received Zevrik's meeting request." She felt the cold clarity of a situation that has just gotten significantly worse arrive in her chest and settle there. Ferris had known the moment he received the meeting request that something was wrong. He'd come anyway, because not coming would have confirmed guilt faster, because he'd calculated he could manage the situation if he arrived in person. He'd been wrong about that. But before he rode out to meet them, he'd triggered his emergency protocol. 12 hours. "Where is Zevrik?" she said. "War room. He needs your documentation now." She gathered the papers and moved. The war room was in the center of the facility, and it was full when she entered. Eastern garrison officers standing around a territory map, that covered the central table. Zevrik at the head of it, with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his operational face, the one that had no room in it for anything except the immediate problem. He looked at her when she entered. "Tell me what you have," he said. She told him. Laid the documentation pattern out in direct sequence, no preamble, no softening. The 3 access points Ferris had weakened, the specific troop repositioning that had been concealed in report modifications, the timing of the changes relative to the Thornfield campaign documentation she'd found in the cache. She spoke for 8 minutes without stopping, and the room listened, and she felt the attention in it like a physical pressure, and she didn't moderate her pace for it because there wasn't time. When she finished, the room was quiet for 1 full second. Then it became very loud. Zevrik let it run for 30 seconds. The officers talking, the rapid tactical assessment moving through the room, and then he cut through it with a single word. "Enough." The room went quiet. "The 3 access points," he said. He looked at the map, then at Seris. In the Ashfang documentation, did the Thornfield approach vectors align with the weakened positions or the originally reported positions? She had already thought about this. The weakened positions. They built their approach strategy around the gaps Ferris created, which means their column is moving toward access points they believe are underdefended, because they are underdefended. "But we know that now," Zevrik said. "Yes." He looked at the map for 3 seconds. She watched him do the mathematics of terrain and timing and available force with the specific focused stillness of a man who has made this kind of calculation before and knows that the calculation matters more than any other thing happening in the room right now. Here's the thing about military decision-making under genuine time pressure that nobody who has only read about it ever fully grasps. The decisions are not dramatic. They are not preceded by stirring moments of clarity or emotional resolution. They are made in the cold space between incomplete information and 0 time to complete it, and the quality of the decision-maker is measured entirely by what they do with that gap. Zevrik looked at the map for 3 seconds and made 3 decisions. Garrison redeployment to the southern access point. 4 hours out, double the reported strength. They'll hit the strongest position first because the approach vector commits them to it. When they engage and find resistance they didn't expect, their column communication will reach their rear command. He pointed. "That's when we close the northern pinch. They'll be in a corridor with no clean extraction." He looked at his senior officers. "Move in the next 40 minutes or the timing doesn't work. Go." The room evacuated with the efficiency of people who have drilled for this. Seris stayed. Zevrik stayed. For a moment it was just the 2 of them and the territory map and the quiet of a room that had just been full. "You'll stay back from the engagement," he said. Not a question. "No," she said. He looked at her. "The documentation I've been building needs someone who can read it in real time. If the column command surrenders, and you need intelligence extracted from their senior officers," she said. "And I know the Thornfield network contacts from the Ashfang cache. I can identify their senior command structure faster than anyone else in this facility. I'm an operational asset and you know it." He held her gaze. "The engagement is not going to be clean," he said. "Engagement never is," she said. "I grew up on the Northern Territory's border. I know what a military column looks like when it's been caught in a corridor." He looked at her for 2 more seconds. "Stay behind the forward line," he said. "When the column command surrenders, you move up, not before." Agreed. They rode out within the hour. The night was cold and full, and the Eastern Territory spread out around them with the particular darkness of terrain that has not yet decided what it is, still the edge of things, the frontier where the Nightclaw Imperium's reach met the ambitions of people who thought the reach had a limit. This is what Seris thought about as they rode. About the nature of edges, about what it meant to operate at the boundary of a thing, between empires, between identities, between who you have been and who the circumstances are requiring you to become. She had been at an edge her entire adult life. The Northern Territory border, the Ashfang court, the Moon Oath dais, the mountain border at midnight. She was still at an edge. The difference was that she had stopped waiting to arrive somewhere solid. Solid ground was a story that people told themselves to manage the anxiety of impermanence. In her experience, the only people who claimed solid ground were people who had stopped moving, and stopping had its own costs. She rode and let the cold air be exactly as cold as it was. The southern access point was a valley approach flanked by two ridge lines, and she saw the tactical logic of Zevrik's decision the moment she looked at the terrain. The Thornfield column would come through the valley because the approach vectors Seris had built into their strategic planning funneled them there. The ridge lines made the approach fast and the exit narrow. Once a military column of that size committed to the valley, the tactical mathematics became very specific very fast. They positioned in the pre-dawn dark with the efficiency of soldiers who had been told what to do and were doing it, and Seris took her position behind the forward line with Rael as directed and watched the eastern ridge line and waited. Waiting is its own discipline. She had been doing it all night in various forms. The Thornfield advance scouts appeared at the ridge an hour before dawn. She saw the movement before the soldiers around her registered it, because she had grown up watching a different kind of horizon for movement and the skill transferred. She said nothing. The garrison officers saw it within 30 seconds. The column came through at first light. It was substantial, not the size that indicated a full military campaign. This was a pressure operation, not an invasion. Large enough to overwhelm under-defended access points and establish a strategic position that could be used diplomatically. Exactly the kind of force you sent when your strategy assumed the defensive line had been quietly hollowed out by 4 months of corrupted garrison reports. They hit the forward position and found it fully defended. The next 40 seconds were the specific chaos of a military column encountering resistance it did not expect. The communication failure, the command signals conflicting, the tactical structure that assumed one reality suddenly inhabiting a completely different one. She watched it from behind the forward line and felt the particular cold of someone witnessing organized violence and refusing to look away from it, because looking away was a luxury that didn't serve anyone. The corridor closed from the north as Zevrik had ordered. When a military column loses its extraction option, the mathematics of the situation resolve quickly. The senior command does the arithmetic of their position, and the arithmetic is not favorable, and the decision tree narrows to 2 branches. Fight a losing engagement with full casualties on both sides, or signal. They signaled at the 20-minute mark. Seris was already moving before Rael could say the word. She came through the forward line and crossed the valley floor with the focused movement of someone who has a specific job to do, and the Thornfield senior officers who were being separated from their soldiers looked at this woman in plain working clothes crossing toward them and produced an expression of confused assessment that she recognized and ignored. The senior commander was a man named Kalast. She knew the name from the Ashfang documentation, had seen it attached to the contact records for the Thornfield Coalition's Eastern Operation Command. He was 60 and hard-worn and looking at her with the expression of a man calculating what her presence meant for his current situation. "You're not Nightclaw military," he said. "No," she said. "Then who are you?" "I'm the person who read 7 months of documentation about your operation this morning," she said. "And I'm going to ask you some specific questions about your contact network, and the quality of your answers is going to determine a significant number of things for a significant number of people, including you." She held his gaze. "Start with Seris. Tell me how the contact was first established." He looked at her for a long moment, then he started talking. "She worked for 2 hours in the valley, moving between the senior officers, cross-referencing their accounts against the documentation architecture in her memory, building the picture of the Thornfield network's operational structure from the ground up, with the thoroughness of someone who understands that incomplete intelligence is sometimes worse than no intelligence at all. Zevrik was present throughout, not interfering, managing the military containment of the situation and watching her work with the expression she had cataloged as paying full attention. When she had what she needed, she stepped back from the final officer and looked at her notes and felt the exhaustion of the last 20 hours arrive with the full weight it had been accumulating. Zevrik came to stand beside her. "Tell me it's complete," he said. "Complete enough," she said. "The full network extends through 4 Thornfield Coalition territories. The operational contacts are documented. 2 of the 4 are going to cooperate fully to reduce their own exposure. The other 2 will need more pressure." She looked at her notes. "It's dismantleable. Thoroughly." He was quiet for a moment. "You built that in 2 hours," he said. "I had 7 months of foundation," she said. "Drazhen's people built the foundation. I just read it fast." Another silence. "That's the thing that keeps returning," he said. His voice was careful. "Drazhen's foundation, his intelligence network inside my operations. The assets he's running that we haven't identified yet. He looked at her. The Ferris situation is resolved. The Thornfield operation is dismantled. But the infrastructure that gave him 7 months of visibility into my Eastern Command is still in place, and I don't know where it is. She had been thinking about this since the cache. I can find it, she said. He looked at her. Not through the Ashfang network, she said. I don't have enough access left on these credentials, and even if I did, active intelligence assets aren't documented in field caches. But I know how Drazhen builds networks. I know his architecture, the structural preferences, the kinds of positions he targets, the relationship patterns he uses to develop sources. She met his gaze. I spent 2 years inside it. I'm probably the most qualified person to look for it from the inside. Zevrik said nothing for a long moment. Here's what she understood about the silence. It was not the silence of a man calculating whether to trust her. He had moved past that question on the mountain border. This was a different silence, the silence of a man who is about to give someone access to something that matters to him and is taking one full moment to acknowledge the weight of that before he does it. You'll need full access to the inter-council communication records for the last 8 months, he said. Yes. And the senior command network reports? Yes. That's everything, he said. That's the full interior of the operational architecture. I know, she said. He held her gaze. If you find something that implicates someone close to me, he said, someone I trust the way I trusted Ferris, I'll tell you, she said, immediately, without managing the implications first. I told you that on the mountain road, and I meant it the way I mean everything. He looked at her. I know, he said. Then his eyes moved past her. She turned. Aldrich was standing 20 feet behind her at the edge of the valley floor, having ridden out with the operational party and stayed well back during the engagement, and he was looking at her with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a conversation for several hours and is watching the moment arrive. She looked at him. Then she looked back at Zevrik. I need an hour, she said. Take it, he said. He moved away without ceremony, and she registered that also. The instinct not to occupy the space that wasn't his. She noted it and filed it. She walked to Aldrich. They stood at the edge of the valley in the early morning light, the sounds of the military containment operation moving around them, and she looked at her cousin and waited for him to begin. He began the way she'd expected, with the justification. The Eastern Holdings had been losing revenue for 3 years. The Drazhen administration's Eastern trade policy had been quietly strangling the Vaelor family's territorial income. When Varel Thorn had made contact through an intermediary and described what was planned, not the ceremony, not the specific mechanism, but the general outline of a transition that would open new trade terms for the Eastern Holdings, he had calculated that refusing offered no protection and cooperating offered survival. She listened to all of it. She listened without interrupting, without the visible reaction that would have told him where her edges were, without the performance of composure that she'd been doing all night. She simply listened with the full attention of someone who has decided to hear the complete thing before she forms a response. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. You made a business calculation, she said. Yes, he said. You decided that the Eastern Holdings revenue projections outweighed the fact that your cousin was being sold into a political architecture she didn't know she was inside, she said. And you maintained 2 years of warm correspondence while that calculation was active. Aldrich looked at the ground. I told myself it wasn't going to hurt you, he said, that the transition was going to happen regardless of what I did, and at least if I cooperated, the family would be positioned to Oshti Bamtetmam Basiti. You told yourself a story, she said. That made your choice feel like something other than what it was. He was quiet. She looked at him for a long time, at the face she had known her entire life, at the person who had been the warmth of family across 2 years of the loneliest political work she had ever done, who had written about the harvest and the family news and made her feel less alone in Drazhen's court, who had known. This is the thing about people who betray you for comprehensible reasons. The incomprehensible betrayals are almost easier. When someone hurts you for reasons that make no human sense, you can place them outside the category of people you ever trusted. When someone hurts you for reasons that make complete human sense, fear, financial pressure, the calculation of survival in a system that doesn't reward loyalty, you cannot do that. You have to hold them as a full person who made a choice, which is considerably more complicated and considerably more true. I'm not going to tell you it was forgivable, she said. I don't know that yet. I don't know if the version of us that exists after this is something I want. She held his gaze. What I know is that you came. You rode through the night and you came to wherever I was, instead of staying behind the border in the safety of having chosen Drazhen's side. She paused. Tell me why. Aldrich looked at her. Because when I saw you walk off that dais, he said, I understood what I had helped build, and I could not. He stopped, tried again. I could not let it stand uncorrected. You're correcting it now, she said, 7 months late. Yes. The information you have about Varel Thorn's contact network, the specific communications you were part of. I need all of it. Her voice was even and direct. Not because I'm forgiving you, because it's useful and I'm going to use it and you are going to give it to me completely and without managing what it reveals about your own choices. Yes, he said. And then she said, we're going to figure out what comes after that, not tonight. Tonight there's too much else moving, but we're going to figure it out. He nodded. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she turned. Zevrik was 30 feet away near the command position, and he was looking at the territory map his officers had spread across a campaign table, and his expression had changed from the operational focus of the engagement. Something else was on it. Something that landed between controlled urgency and the particular quality of a man who has just received information that has restructured the situation he thought he understood. She walked to him. What happened? She said. He looked up from the map. A rider came in from the capital while you were with your cousin, he said. His voice was flat in a way that told her the flatness was doing significant work. From my council's intelligence division. They've been running an independent assessment of the Ferris situation since I sent the initial report this morning. She waited. Their assessment found something I didn't send them, he said. Something that wasn't in the Ferris documentation. Something that came from cross-referencing the Eastern Garrison records against the Inner Council Communication Archive. He held her gaze. The Inner Council Archive that you asked for access to this morning. Her chest went still. Tell me, she said. The Ashfang intelligence asset inside my network, he said. The one that gave Drazhen 7 months of visibility into my Eastern Command. He looked at her with the expression of a man who is about to say something he has already decided to say and is not going to take back. The asset's first contact with the Ashfang network was 26 months ago. 26 months ago, 2 months before Seris Vaelor had arrived at the Ashfang Dominion to begin her formal bonding period with Drazhen Morvain. She looked at him. The valley was cold and the morning was full, and somewhere behind her Aldrich was standing with 7 months of Varel Thorn's communications in his memory, and the Thornfield column was contained in a corridor it hadn't expected to be in, and the Empire was intact, and the network was dismantleable. And the asset that had given Drazhen 26 months of access to the Nightclaw Imperium's Inner Council communications had been active for 2 months before she'd ever set foot in his court. It's not you, Zevrik said. The timeline doesn't fit, and the access profile doesn't fit, and I am not telling you this as an accusation. His voice was careful and certain. I'm telling you because you need to know what we're looking at. Someone in your Inner Council has been reporting to Drazhen for over 2 years, she said. Yes. And you need me to find them, she said. Yes, he said. Using everything you know about how he builds networks, everything you learned in 2 years inside his architecture. He looked at her. Can you do it? She looked at the territory map, at the eastern access points, at the shape of an empire whose interior was less known to its own ruler than he had understood this morning. She thought about Drazhen Morvain standing in the Celestine Citadel with his war authorization and his signal fires and his legal mechanisms and his network of assets that had been running for over 2 years. She thought about what it meant to have been close to someone for 2 years without knowing the full shape of what surrounded them. She thought about the woman on the Moon Oath dais 24 hours ago in ceremonial silk. Then she thought about who was standing in this valley now. Yes, she said. Zevrik held her gaze for one long moment. Then he said, There's one more thing. She waited. The rider from the capital brought a second communication, he said. Not from my council, from the Celestine Citadel. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not calculation, not controlled composure, but the face of a man who is about to give someone something they will not be able to put down once they pick it up. Drazen is riding for the border, himself, with a full diplomatic company and his personal guard. The morning held perfectly still around her. "He's coming," she said. "He'll reach the Nightclaw border in 16 hours, Zevrik said. He sent no advance communication requesting entry, no diplomatic notation, no formal channel." He paused. "He's just coming." Seris looked at the eastern ridgeline, at the terrain she had just watched a military operation move across, at the empire she was standing in the middle of, with access she'd asked for and been given and not yet used and now understood was going to be needed faster than she'd planned. At the man standing in front of her, who had known her for less than 24 hours and had given her more honest access to the interior of his world than Drazen had managed in 2 years of formal bonding, and who was watching her face right now with the full weight of a question he was not going to ask out loud because he had decided she was the kind of person who didn't need it asked out loud. Drazen was coming, with a full diplomatic company and his personal guard and no advance communication and no formal channel. Not a diplomatic visit, not a political maneuver, something else. And every piece of intelligence she had, honed across 2 years in his court and sharpened by the last 24 hours into something considerably more precise, told her that whatever Drazhen Morvain was riding toward the Nightclaw border for, it was the thing underneath all the other things, the thing that none of the architecture had been built to show. She had 16 hours to find the asset inside Zevrik's inner council. And then Drazen was going to arrive. And whatever happened when he did was going to determine the shape of the next 10 years of Northern Empire politics, and possibly something considerably more personal than that. She looked at Zevrik. "Show me the Inner Council archive," she said. She found the asset in 11 hours, not 1611. She had asked for the Inner Council archive, and Zevrik had given her the Inner Council archive, and she had sat in a plain room with good light and worked through it with the systematic focus of someone who understands that the quality of attention she brought to this task was the only variable she controlled. The asset was not where she expected to find it. That was the thing about Drazen's network architecture that she understood better than anyone else available to find it. He did not build in obvious places. He built in the gaps between obvious places and the positions that were important enough to have real access, but peripheral enough that nobody thought to audit them. Not senior command, not inner council members, the person adjacent to those people, the one who managed the correspondence, the one who was in every room but credited with being in none of them. The asset was a woman named Tessa Vorn, chief correspondence secretary to Zevrik's inner council for 3 years, present at every meeting, privy to every communication, invisible in the way that competent administrative people are invisible, through the assumption that the work they do is mechanical rather than intelligent, that they process information rather than possess it. Drazen had understood that assumption and built on it. Seris had understood it too, because she had been that person, not a secretary, but the woman in the room whose competence was used without being credited, whose access was granted without being fully reckoned with. She recognized the position the way you recognize a mirror. She brought the documentation to Zevrik at the 10th hour and watched his face move through the recognition and the calculation and the specific weight of a man discovering that the architecture of his own world has been accessed for 26 months through a person he had never thought to distrust, because she had never been important enough to distrust. He was quiet for a long time. "She's been in that position for 3 years, he said. "She was placed," Seris said. "The timeline of her appointment aligns with the establishment of the first Ashfang contact. She didn't come to them. They built her in." Zevrik looked at the documentation. "How do you want to handle it?" she said. He looked up. The question appeared to surprise him briefly. Not the content of it, but the framing. The instinct to ask rather than assume. "Quietly," he said. "She'll be removed from the position tonight. The communication channels she's been using will be identified and closed. The Ashfang network loses its access point without knowing it's been found." "Which gives you a window," Seris said, "before Drazen arrives and realizes the asset is gone." "Yes," she nodded. Then they both sat with the silence of people who have just solved the immediate problem and are now in the presence of the larger one. Drazen was 6 hours out from the border. The operational architecture was handled. The Thornfield network was dismantled. Ferris was in garrison custody. Tessavorn would be removed before morning. The eastern defensive line would be rebuilt properly over the next 3 weeks using the accurate garrison documentation Seris had helped reconstruct. The empire was intact. What remained was the man riding toward it, and every question his arrival represented that could not be resolved through documentation or intelligence work or the careful cross-referencing of contact records. Seris left the working room and walked through the facility into the cold air outside and stood in it for a while. The night was deep and clear, the kind of clear that arrives in mountain territory when the air is cold enough to have no patience for cloud cover. She could see everything above her that wasn't obscured by earth or structure. She thought about Drazhen riding through this same night toward the border. She had been trying not to think about it, deliberately, consciously, with the same management that she brought to everything that needed managing in order for the work to get done. She had set the question of his arrival to one side and done the 11 hours of work that needed doing, and she had done it well, and now the work was done, and the question was back. Why was he coming? Not the tactical answer. She had worked through the tactical answers, and none of them fully satisfied. The asset removal would have happened regardless of his physical presence. The Thornfield operation was already over. The diplomatic leverage of arriving in person without formal channel notification was real but limited. It was a provocation more than a maneuver, and Drazhen Morvain did not make provocations for their own sake. He was coming for something specific. She had 2 possible answers, and she did not like either of them. The first was the legal mechanism, the reinitiation option embedded in the bond severance. He had come to exercise it, to arrive in person, to press his claim, to make her return to the Ashfang Dominion, the visible and public outcome of whatever political conversation he intended to have with Zevrik at the border. The second possibility was worse, or better. She could not determine which. The second possibility was that he had come because the dispatch had not been architecture, that the intelligence about Ferris and the Thornfield network had been exactly what it claimed to be, genuine, costly, sent with knowledge of what it would reveal about the depth of his own operations inside Nightclaw territory. That he had given her something real and dangerous, and had done it because the version of him that existed underneath the 20 years of strategic refinement and calculated management and fear-driven control was not entirely gone. That it had looked at the woman walking off the Moon Oath dais without pleading or performance, with nothing but the dignity of a person who has just been accurately described as worth less than a military access point, and had understood what it had done. She stood in the cold air and held both possibilities with equal weight. She was still holding them when Zevrik came out and stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. This was something she had noticed about him across the last 24 hours, the comfort with silence. Not the performed silence of a man withholding himself strategically, but the genuine ease of someone who understood that not every space between people needed to be filled. It was rare. She had spent 2 years in a court where silence was always tactical, and had forgotten that it could be something else. "When he arrives," Zevrik said finally. "Yes," she said. "What you do is yours," he said. "I want to be clear about that before he gets here. Whatever happens at that border, the decision is yours. Not mine, not his, not the calculus of 2 empires figuring out what's diplomatically convenient." He looked at her. "Yours." She looked at him. She had been accumulating things about Zevrik Draven across the last 24 hours and storing them in the careful way that she stored information that mattered. The way he'd come back into the Citadel for his 7 people when the calculation said leave them. The way he'd told her about Aldrich, knowing she was going to find it harder than anything else. The way he'd handed her full access to the interior of his operational architecture and said, "Can you do it? Not will you?" As though the capability was the only question and the trust was already settled. The way he'd said what you do is yours, and meant it in a way she could verify because she had spent 2 years learning to tell the difference between performed deference and actual respect. She turned to face him fully. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask it." "What you said on the mountain road," she said, "about the reports, about the last 6 months, about not having clean language for what it became." She held his gaze. "I need to know if that was true, or if it was the right thing to say in that moment to a woman who had just had the worst night of her adult life." He looked at her without flinching. "It was true," he said. "People say true things for strategic reasons," she said. "True and strategic aren't mutually exclusive. I've been inside an empire that proved that for 2 years. Yes, he said. They're not mutually exclusive. You're asking me to tell you which one it was. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Not evasion. She could tell the difference now. The quiet of a man finding the precise language for something he doesn't usually put into language. Both, he said. It was true, and it was strategically useful that it was true. I'm not going to tell you those things can always be separated because sometimes they can't. He paused. What I can tell you is that when I said it, I was not calculating its effect. I was saying it because you had asked me not to give you the performance, and I had decided I was going to honor that even when honoring it complicated my position. He held her gaze. That's the distinction I can give you. Not purity of motive, honoring the request. She looked at him for a long moment. That's a better answer than the simple one would have been, she said. I know, he said. That's why I gave it. She almost smiled. She didn't. The night was too full and too close to the thing it was moving toward. I'm not going back with him, she said. Zevrik said nothing. I need to say that out loud before he arrives, she said. Not for you, for me. So it's been said, and the decision is real and not something I'm still making when he gets here. She looked at the dark ahead. I'm not going back. Whatever he's come to say, whatever the mechanism, whatever the argument, the answer is no. Okay, Zevrik said. Just that. Not relief, not satisfaction. Just the acknowledgement of a man who had said the decision was hers and was honoring that without making it about himself. She filed it. Drazen arrived at the border at midday. The diplomatic company was exactly what the writer had described. Formal, substantial, the visible infrastructure of a king who is making a statement with his presence before he has said a single word. 20 personal guard, 6 council ministers. The full ceremonial weight of the Ashfang Dominion pressing up against the Nightclaw border in broad daylight with no advance notification and no formal channel. Seris stood at the border marker when he rode up, not behind it, at it. He pulled his horse up 10 feet away and looked at her. And she looked at him, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, and the 2 empires waited on either side of the line cut into old stone. He looked different in daylight outside his court. Not smaller. He was not a small man in any dimension, but the ceremonial infrastructure was stripped away and what remained was just the man. And the man was something she had spent 2 years in proximity to and had never fully seen because the court had always been in the way. She saw him now. She saw the exhaustion. He had ridden hard and he showed it. The lines around his eyes deeper than usual, the set of his shoulders carrying the particular weight of someone who has been making calculations all night and has not arrived at a comfortable answer. She saw something else underneath the exhaustion, something she had seen briefly on the Moon Oath dais and then not again until this moment. She saw the man who was afraid, not of her, not of Zevrik's empire or the Thornfield situation or the political fallout of the last 24 hours. Afraid in the larger way, the way she had identified in the cache the morning before. He was afraid that the thing underneath the crown was not enough, had never been enough, that 20 years of strategic brilliance had been constructed on top of that fear rather than in spite of it, and that somewhere in the architecture of last night, the construction had been revealed for what it was. You found Ferris, he said. Yes. And the correspondence secretary. She looked at him. How long did you know? About Tessa Vorn specifically. 4 months, he said. I placed her. She was mine. He said it without shame or apology, in the flat register of a man stating operational facts. I'm telling you because you already know, and because telling you is the only honest thing I can do at this point that costs me something real. She absorbed it. The dispatch was real, she said. Yes. Ferris was real. The Thornfield documentation was real. Yes. But Tessa Vorn was yours. Yes. She stood in the cold daylight and looked at him and thought about what it meant to be given the truth in pieces. Each piece real, each piece complete in itself. The picture they assembled together something more complicated than any individual piece suggested. Drazen had given her real intelligence about a threat to Zevrik's empire. He had also maintained a separate asset inside that empire that had been active for 26 months. Both things were simultaneously and completely true. He had sent her across the border carrying intelligence that would make her essential to Zevrik's operational crisis, which had also given her access to the Inner Council archive, which had led her to Tessa Vorn. He had given her the tool to find his own asset. She stared at him. "Why?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Because I needed to know," he said, "whether you would find it." The morning held still. Here is what she understood in that moment. Standing at the border marker between two empires with her broken bond mark faded almost to nothing on her wrist. Drazhen Morvain had spent 20 years constructing a world in which he controlled every variable, managed every outcome, and ensured that no person or situation existed in his proximity that he did not fully understand. He had done this because control was how he survived. Control was the language his fear spoke. And he had sent her into Zevrik Draven's empire with real intelligence and his own asset's location embedded in the archive she was going to access, and he had waited to see what she would do with it, not to trap her, to see her, to see the full dimensions of the person he had spent 2 years in proximity to without ever fully reckoning with. Because the court had always been in the way, and the bond had always been in the way, and the calculation had always been in the way. And he had needed her to be somewhere where none of those things were in the way to understand what she actually was. He had broken the bond to see what she would do without it. She had not anticipated that interpretation, and it cost her something to arrive at it because it made the whole architecture more human and more terrible and more genuinely Drazhen than anything she had assigned to him before. "You destroyed the bond," she said quietly, "to run an assessment." "I destroyed the bond," he said, "because I was afraid to keep it." The silence after that was the longest one yet. "You could have told me that," she said. "No," he said. "I couldn't. Not then." He looked at her with the tired eyes of a man who has spent the last 24 hours arriving at a truth he should have arrived at considerably earlier and knows it. "I did not have the language for it then. I'm not certain I have it now. But I have enough to ride to a border in person with no diplomatic preparation and say it to your face." She looked at him. "This is the thing about the people who have shaped you, the ones who have taken up residence in the architecture of your thinking and changed the way the structure holds. You do not stop knowing them simply because the relationship they occupied has been burned away." Drazhen Morvain had taught her to think in contingencies, had taught her to read rooms and faces and the silence between words, had given her access to the most sophisticated political infrastructure in the Northern Territories, and trusted her competence with it, even when he was afraid of what her competence meant. He had also broken her publicly, had used her as a piece in a plan that spanned months, had renamed his fear as strategy until the fear was invisible even to himself. Both things were true, completely and simultaneously. "What did you come here to ask?" she said. He looked at her directly. "Nothing," he said. "I came to tell you what I told you. I'm not asking for anything." He paused. "The legal mechanism exists. The reinitiation option is mine. I'm telling you I won't use it." She stared at him. "You're surrendering the mechanism," she said. "I'm telling you it's gone," he said. "Not because I'm required to, because I choose to. Because keeping it was the last piece of the control architecture, and I am done building control architectures around people like—" He stopped, looked at the border marker, looked back at her. "Around people who deserve better than that." She had not expected this. She had prepared for the mechanism, had been ready to refuse it, clearly and with the full weight of the 24 hours behind her. She had not prepared for him to arrive and dismantle it himself. She was quiet for a long moment. "Virel Thorn," she said, "the Red Claw Alliance. The alliance will be renegotiated on different terms," he said. "The Thornfield documentation you built gives me leverage with the Eastern Coalition that makes the Red Claw terms less urgent." He paused. "Virel is a capable political operative. She will find other arrangements." "And your court," she said, "the noble houses that watched everything that happened last night, will adapt," he said. "Courts adapt to whatever the sovereign makes real." Something moved briefly in his expression. "That's the one thing I've always understood correctly." She looked at him. She thought about what it cost him to be standing at a border in a rival empire's territory with no diplomatic cover and no formal channel, having ridden through the night to say things that dismantled the architecture he'd spent months constructing in front of his own council ministers who were sitting their horses 20 feet behind him watching their king do something that none of their protocols had prepared them for. This is what genuine strength actually looks like, underneath all the performances of it. Not the domination, not the iron law and the strategic brilliance and the merciless calculation. Those things were real, but they were also armor. Strength was this: being willing to stand in your own wreckage and name what caused it, even when naming it costs you the last piece of the control you've been building your life around. Drazhen Morvain had finally done the hardest thing available to him. She did not forgive him, not yet. Forgiveness was not a switch that flipped at the moment of the right words. It was a process, long and non-linear and sometimes incomplete, and she was honest enough with herself to know she was at the beginning of it and not the end. But she saw him. She saw him fully, perhaps for the first time, and she allowed the scene to be exactly as complicated as it was. "Go home," she said. "Fix what you broke. Not for me, because it needs fixing and you're the one who broke it." She held his gaze. The Eastern trade policy that's been strangling the Vaelor holdings, the noble house inheritance reforms, the agricultural treaty that expired 8 months ago. She looked at him. "You know what needs doing. Do it." He looked at her for a long moment. "And you," he said. "I'm staying," she said. He nodded, slowly. Once. Then he turned his horse. She watched him ride back toward his company, and she watched the diplomatic formation reform around him, and she watched Drazhen Morvain, sovereign of the Ashfang Dominion, turn south toward his border and begin the ride home. She did not watch until he disappeared. She watched until she had seen enough, and then she turned. Zevrik was standing 30 feet behind her. He had not come to the border marker. He had held his position and given her the space the conversation required. She had been aware of his presence the entire time, and she had understood it as exactly the thing it was. Not absence, not tactical distance, but the instinct of a man who had said the decision was hers and had stayed back far enough to mean it. She walked to him. He looked at her face, reading it the way she had learned to read faces, and he did not ask what had happened because he had been close enough to hear the broad outline, and he was intelligent enough to understand the rest. "He surrendered the mechanism," she said. "I heard," Zevrik said. "He's going home," she said. "I know." She stopped in front of him and looked at him in the clear midday light, and thought about 24 hours that had contained more genuine living than most years managed. About the moon oath dais and the cold causeway and the mountain border and the 11 hours of documentation and the valley engagement and the conversation with Aldrich that was still unfinished and would need to be finished carefully over time. About this man who had come to her humiliation with a plan, and some of the plan had been his, and some of it had been Drazhen's, and some of it had been hers, and the overlapping of those three things had produced something that none of them had entirely intended. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask it." "The access you gave me to the Inner Council archive," she said. "The Eastern Garrison documentation. The operational authority I've been operating with for the last 24 hours. She looked at him. "What is that going forward? What does that mean in your world?" He held her gaze. "What do you want it to mean?" he said. "I want to know what you're offering," she said. "Clearly. Not in the language of courts or diplomatic custom, or the kind of careful framing that means three things simultaneously, plainly." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm offering you a position that doesn't have a name yet," he said. "Not queen, not political consort, not advisor or operative or any other category that already exists." He looked at her steadily. "I'm offering you the work. The actual work of an empire that has just discovered it has significant internal vulnerabilities and needs someone who understands how sophisticated networks are built and how they're dismantled." He paused. "I'm offering you that work as a partner, not as a position you fill, as a person you are." She looked at him. "That's not a clean offer," she said. "No," he said, "it's not. It's complicated and uncertain and doesn't fit into any existing political category and will require ongoing negotiation of what it actually means in practice," she said. "Yes," he said, "all of that." She stood in the cold daylight on the border of a rival empire and felt the weight of every choice the last 24 hours had required, and felt underneath that weight the things she had identified the night before when she'd stood in the dark of a mountain road and felt genuinely like herself for the first time in years. The clarity of a person operating at the full edge of their actual capability. No performance, no adjustment, No management of how her competence was received by the people around her. Just the work, and the full dimensions of who she was doing it. The Eastern Garrison documentation needs to be rebuilt correctly, she said. The Thornfield network contacts in the two uncooperative territories need to be addressed through channels that don't advertise what we know. The inner council communication protocols need restructuring now that the Tessavorn access point is closed. She looked at him. That's the immediate work. I can do all of it. I know, he said. And Aldrich, she said, I need time to figure out what that is. It's not resolved, and it won't be resolved fast. Take the time, he said. She looked at him. This is going to be complicated, she said. Yes, he said. I expect so. She nodded. And something in her chest that had been held in a particular tension since the Moon Oath dais, the tension of a person who has been waiting to understand where they were standing, released, not into ease, not into safety, into something more honest than either of those things, into the full and complicated and genuinely chosen reality of where she actually was. She turned and looked south toward the mountains they had crossed, toward the Ashfang Dominion disappearing in the middle distance, toward Drazhen Morvain riding home to rebuild what his fear had broken, if he had the capacity for it, which she genuinely did not know. She found she hoped he did, not for herself, for the Empire, for the people in it who were not the sovereign and did not have the luxury of learning their lessons at the scale of ceremonial rejection and cross-border military operations, for the eastern settlements bleeding under bad trade policy and the noble house sons losing inheritance rights and the southern provinces waiting 8 months for an agricultural treaty that a council considered beneath formal attention. She had not been able to fix those things as the future queen of the Ashfang Dominion. She had not been allowed to be what she had come there to be. But she had learned everything she needed to learn, and she had carried it across a mountain border in the ruins of a ceremony. And she was standing on the other side of it on her own feet, with access to work that was genuinely proportionate to what she was capable of. That was the lesson the last 24 hours had taken everything to teach. Power is not what you're given. Not the crown or the bond or the title or the position in the ceremony. Those things exist only because the people who inhabit them believe they do. Real power is what you remain when all of those things have been taken from you in public. It is what you carry across a mountain border at midnight when you have nowhere to go and choose to go anyway. It is what you find in 11 hours of archive documentation when the Empire needs it found. It is the ability to stand at a border marker and say, "Go home. Fix what you broke, not for me, because it needs fixing." That was what she had. She turned back toward the Nightclaw interior, toward the work, toward the complicated and unfinished and genuinely alive thing that the last 24 hours had made possible. Zevrik walked beside her. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The mountains were cold and enormous and entirely indifferent to empires and crowns and bond ceremonies and the specific weight of two people walking toward the same thing without having agreed to name it yet. Above them, the sky was the clear blue that only arrives after a storm has passed, and the air has been scoured clean of everything it was carrying. It was, she thought, a good sky for starting over. Not from nothing. From everything.